Hello. This is Tales of Dread. In this episode, we've put together a bunch of Bigfoot stories. So have fun, but don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and click the bell icon, and watch out for what lurks beneath. I was staying in a cabin in the mountains on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland. One day, it snowed, and when it snows there, you're pretty much stuck. There are now a lot of bears and deer living up there. We kept salt licks, corn, and other things around for them to eat, not to hunt. Well, I walked by the back window, which is above the underground garage where we kept the snowmobiles and four-wheelers. I see something big and brownish sitting in the snow about 50 feet from the cabin. I was surprised because I had never seen a bear there, but I had heard that they lived there. So I ran to get my mom to show her. As we walked back to the window, the thing stood up, and I don't mean like a bear, I mean like a big tall man. It then turned around, walked with a huge stride, and basically ran into the woods. How the hell did that happen? My uncle says, that's a Sasquatch. He's famous around here. I don't know if he was trying to make us feel better by making a funny comment to defuse the situation. But after that, I never went back alone to those woods. That's how I found out that the woods near where my father grew up have an old, empty house or houses spread out all over them. I'm from the Hudson Valley. Anyone from that area knows that old houses, or at least the foundations of old houses, can still be found in the woods there. Anyway, when my dad was younger, he and everyone else would basically climb up this mountain to an old house that had been left empty. He said that it was old and had black and white pictures, but that a lot of teenagers would go up there to smoke and hang out. So a lot of things just got broken. On the way up the mountain, you had to climb up what was basically a cliff, for lack of a better word. It was just a flat rock surface that you had to scale. This was the way he always went down. So one night he went up alone and was making his way down as night fell. As he was lowering himself down the drop-off, he felt an odd presence and looked up to where he had just been standing. He only got a quick look because whatever it was made him climb down the mountain and run home. He said that it was mostly very tall, sluggish, and covered in hair. At first glance, it didn't look like a bear. Usually, when you take something to your parents and tell them, you have some doubts. But after he recently went to see his mother and she told him that some of the stories he told her were true, it made it more likely that he was telling the truth. Also, there's the whole you'll see what you want to see thing. So who knows, I'm scared of places with a lot of trees. To be truthful, when I was a young teen, I went on a 4-day canoe trip with some friends in a remote part of the southeast United States. We stayed up late, built a fire, and played around like boys do. I am sure that we made a lot of noise. When the fire died down to coals, we were just sitting around talking when we heard a high-pitched scream in the distance. We were scared for a while, but then we forgot about it and went back to talking. A little while later, one of my friends pointed across the river and asked, "Guys, what is that?" We looked around and saw a huge figure standing in the trees and watching us. It was dim, but the full moon made it bright, and it was very big. We just looked at it in shock for a moment before moving away and going to get the dad of one of our friends and some flashlights. He was determined to show us that there was nothing there. When we went back, it was still there. So we used our flashlights to try to get a better look, but it wasn't enough. But when our flashlights hit the things I had, they shone red. We watched it look at us for a while before it walked up a slope, turned around, and went back into the woods. That happened more than 10 years ago, and we don't talk about it very often. All of us were pretty scared. Finally, I get to tell my story. About 10 years ago, my family and I went up to the White Mountains in Arizona to cut down our Christmas tree. My grandfather was in the front seat of our truck, and my mom and sister were in the back. I was in the back of the truck with the German short-haired pointer that belongs to our family. We were driving through the woods when all of a sudden my dog started to bark and growl. So I tried to figure out what it was thinking. It could be a mountain lion or a bear. About 60 to 70 yards away, I saw a tall, dark figure walking parallel to the road. When I told my dad, "I think I see Bigfoot," he just laughed and kept driving. I yelled at him to stop the truck. When I turned around to look at it again, the person had turned around and was now walking away from the road. To this day, the last thing I saw was the head of the thing going down a hill. I still don't know what I saw, and every time the subject comes up, my dad makes me tell the story so he can laugh. He didn't see anything himself, but he heard that I lived in rural Massachusetts, which means miles of woods with suburban areas spread out in between. I was walking down the logging trail my grandfather used to get ready for his funeral. I also love to look for mushrooms, so I always walk slowly and look at the ground. Friends pretty much hate me. So I got to this cool little white captain mushroom and stopped to take a close-up picture of it. That's when I heard it. The best way I can explain it is by saying that it sounds like someone with big knuckles punching a tree. Now I know what a deer sounds like when it is trying to protect its young by stomping on trees and hitting its antlers against them. I've heard bear, fisher cat, moose, and just about every other animal that lives in western Massachusetts. So, of course, I looked up and was scared to death. It kept going thud thud thud. It kept going at the same speed for a few minutes. So, since I'm a curious person, I whistled in a way that couldn't be confused with a bird. I hear a quick, low whistle right after I whistle. My first thought is that some stupid logger must be cutting down trees on the land past the gate that says no trespassing. I know. So I shouted hello about as loudly as I could. Then, whatever it was ran away faster than I've ever heard a person run, based on what I know about deer, dogs, moose, and bears. I just decided that I could have thought it was a creature with 4 legs. I know what they sound like when they run, and this was much more like something with 2 legs. I know for sure that's true. What doesn't make sense is that the 2-legged creature that ran away from me faster than any other 2-legged creature I've ever heard of also sounded like it was at least 250 pounds. The steps were very fast and loud. Many people think that Bigfoot has a spiritual connection to the forest it lives in and, by extension, to the animals that live there. I don't think it's a coincidence that this happened on the day of my grandfather's funeral. I ran the whole way home, and I haven't looked back since. Okay, so let me set the scene with a story about me and my friends. We were on a camping trip with the Boy Scouts to shoot guns. We were between 20 and 30 people. We were in a small cabin with a front and back door and windows on both sides. All around the area were wooden tables. About 1/8 of a mile down a gravel road in the dark was the cabin for adults. The Boy Scouts were there, so there was a buddy system. It was around midnight, and everyone had been telling scary stories like they would on any camping trip. So I asked my friend to come with me to the bathroom because I had to go. He said sure and got our knives. We knew there were bears in the woods, so this made us feel safer. We went to the bathroom, then started walking back. Here's where things got scary. I had a natural feeling of fear. When I looked at my friend, he was looking the same way I was. We started to walk a little faster and pull our pocket knives out. Then I looked back and see it. It looked like a cat, but it was about 6 feet tall and stood on its back legs with its shoulders hunched. I was so scared that I took off running. My friend sees it too. When we ran back to the cabin, it started to moan and howl and was right behind us. When we bang on the door, the guys open it for us. They actually believe us when we tell them what we saw. So we locked the front door and checked the back door. It wasn't locked. We put a table against it for safety and put a kid there with his knife. We pull the blinds down on all the windows that have them. One didn't, so we had to sit there with all the lights on. Then we saw that the people looking in through the open windows were all shitting themselves. And the thing slowly walked to the back door, which we heard it hit. Could be trying to get inside. We think it left after that, but we were still sure we were going to die. That night, no one slept. We told the adults when they came to wake us up, but they just laughed and said we were making it up. Even if they didn't believe us, we know it happened. Not me, but my cousin. In the 1980s, my cousin and his wife went camping. It wasn't a popular day for camping, and my cousin said that the ranger told them they were the only ones camping there that night. It's getting late, so it's time to go. And my cousin said he sees something on the other side of the lake. He thought it looked like a bear, so he got his binoculars. It looked a bit like a bear, but it stood on its back legs. He said it wasn't a bear because it looked like it was 70 years old and had longer fur than a bear. He thought it might have been a person in a suit, but it went away quickly. Whatever it was, it scared him so much that he wanted to leave the park right away. His wife thought he was being silly and had an overactive imagination, so she brought a shotgun and insisted that they would be fine if anything did happen. That night, everything is fine until my cousin hears footsteps and wakes up. At this point, his wife is still sleeping, and he doesn't want to wake her up. He just tries to stay as quiet and still as he can. Someone walks up to the tent. My cousin said that he was standing so that the corner of the tent was over his head. This figure bends over and puts its hand around the corner of the tent in a gentle way. So it looks like the figure is putting its hands around my cousin's head. I don't remember how long he said this went on for, but this person did leave in the end. My cousin said that it smelled like someone was working on a car, even though he didn't hear a car. The following morning, nothing had been touched at the campsite, no problems at all. My cousin didn't say anything about where he found footprints. No signs showed that someone had been there. He eventually went to look into the area and found out that the camping areas were said to be a good place to see Bigfoot and other strange creatures. He is sure that he saw a Sasquatch of some kind. I don't know if I should believe him. If anything, I always thought someone was just teasing him. I have several other stories, but I didn't post them because I didn't want the post to be too long or too much. What made me sure was that I and my cousin both saw it happen. We were driving in my cousin's car through some rural areas, and I think it was between 1 and 2 a.m. We didn't smoke or drink, but we did enjoy a nice cruise. We went on this road that went through some thick woods, but we had done it before, so we weren't afraid. It was dark, there was no moon, and it was just lightly raining. We were getting close to a place in the woods where there was a street light, but it was old and was starting to go out. An old building used to be there, but it was torn down, but the light stayed on for a few years. This was in the middle of nowhere, maybe 20 miles from the nearest person. So it was very uncommon for you to pass another car or person at this time. Even though people told him not to go into the woods at night, it didn't help. I was just looking out my window at the trees when we got to a light and the car did a movie turn, like slam on the brakes, do a 180, and freaking burn rubber. The opposite way I get scared and look back through the car window. The street light is shining on the road, and there is a huge black figure standing next to the road. It only needs to take one step to get to the middle of the road, and 2 steps to get to the other side. Right away, I look forward, scared out of my mind, and I see that my cousin is also very scared. We don't talk at all, and he just drops me off. I stay up until the sun comes up, and then I finally go to sleep. After it happened, we never once talked about it. But yes, we did see Bigfoot, and the stories the locals tell are a lot like what we saw. After my brother got married in San Diego last October, I was in California for about 11 days. I just wanted to drive around the state and visit places in California that had always interested me. I love driving almost as much as I love cars. I don't necessarily believe in Sasquatch, but I would never discredit someone else's experience, especially if I wasn't there. So I left. Clipper Mills is in the Sierra Nevada foothills, about 70 miles northeast of Sacramento. Last year, the dam was close to the point where it could break. Pretty remote. So, after Bodega Bay, I drive across the state to get to where I'm going. I get to near Sacramento just in time for a late dinner. So I start the last leg of the journey after dark. Very dark. With all the curves in the roads, it takes me a while to get there. I wanted to find out where the person who posted the video parked that night. He wasn't talking about the video. So, around 11 p.m., I looked through the comment sections of related videos on YouTube to find out more or less about the place. I pulled my rented Camry far off the 2-lane road in the dark to avoid any problems with the very little traffic. I didn't see anyone. So I sat in the dark interior and listened, giving my eyes time to get used to the dark. I sat there for about 20 minutes and heard nothing but different bugs. I also didn't see anything move. Eventually, I didn't want to turn on the lights inside the car, so I crawled out of the driver's side window and into the black night. I had my cell phone, which didn't work, and a handheld GPS to help me find my way back. I use a red flashlight with my telescope in case I get lost in the dark. I stood right next to that car window for about 2 minutes before I got the nerve to move away from my camera. At some point, I walk up the road, but I still only hear bugs. I don't know why, but all of a sudden I turn right and go up into the woods. Right now, my feet are crunching on pine needles, and I think I sound like Bigfoot when I walk around. After about 20 minutes, I stopped to listen and, in addition to the sounds of insects, I heard a faint screeching sound in the distance that didn't sound at all like insects. It seems to be more aware. The mind, which has also gotten used to the dark, is whispering that it sounds like a person in trouble or a large primate. I remain still. I also hear something small moving around in the bushes, and then a minute later I hear the same whale's sad-sounding call. But it's getting close to time to go back to the car. As I walk back to my car, I hear a scary sound every 20 to 30 seconds. It's coming from behind me and in front of me now, and it sounds like it has some kind of language, with sounds that range from low to high and everywhere in between. My mind is having a good time. Just having fun with me. I'd never been so happy to see a camera before. I think I started driving before my behind was in the seat, and I half expected to see dozens of red eyes glowing at me from the dark forest in front of me in the headlights. Now, I'm scared because my mind is telling me that a crazy person who might kill me is right behind me. I went back the way I came, but I did it much faster than when I came from nowhere right in front of me. This black lab runs out of the woods on one side of the road and back into the woods on the other. I almost ran over him. Right then, that scared the crap out of me. I slowed down a bit when I thought about how close I came to killing an innocent dog. I realized I had cell service again about an hour into the drive to Sacramento. I opened my Expedia app and looked for a nearby hotel for the night. Once I was safe in that hotel room, I used my iPad to search the internet and found that what I heard was either a barred owl or a western screech owl. Can never be 100% sure, I suppose. But it's very creepy. I think I'm done wandering around alone in the woods at night. Are you ready to hear a story before bed? This is not my story. My dad tells it every other summer. A few of his friends go with him to Maine to fish for bass. The meeting took place between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. My dad got out of his tent to go to the bathroom because he was too tired to hold it in any longer. About 25 feet away, he heard a snap. He looked up to make sure it wasn't a predator, but he didn't see anything. He pointed his flashlight in a rough direction. He couldn't see much except a pair of eyes because the woods were so thick. He had no idea how high they were off the ground. So, my dad, being the kind of person he is, walked toward it. As he did, whatever it was ran away, giving him a better look. He says it was about 8 feet tall and smelled like garbage. The next day, he told his friends, but they decided to stay for the rest of the week because my dad thought the Bigfoot didn't want to hurt them, and was just curious. He told me about it when he got home, and now, a few years later, I'm telling you that I really hope I can see what he saw one day. So I have no doubt that this world really is strange. I've had many supernatural experiences, but this is not my story. This belongs to my mom, and my mom and uncle had to go get my grandmother. She worked in a small town called Red River, and the blizzard was so bad that my grandmother's car wouldn't start. So she told my mom to pick her up and to be careful because the roads were very slippery. My mother asked my uncle to go with her. They were at the Cuesta in New Mexico, and the storm was bad, so they drove slowly. As I was driving, a big thing started to walk across the road. It was about 9 feet tall and had white fur and big teeth. It just stood there and stared at my mother and uncle before turning away and running into the woods. When they started talking about it, they both agreed that it was a Bigfoot, so my uncle went to the area the next day. In the mountains of New Mexico, he found footprints and took a picture of them. Creepy things happen every day. I was in 12th grade and it was the summer of 2015. We went camping in Alberta, Canada, with 2 other friends. The way up was fine. When we got to the campsite, one of my friends, we'll call him Jeff, brought his girlfriend, Jane. So, when we got to our camping spot, we unloaded our gear, ate lunch, and then went on a hike at 3 o'clock. When we got back at 5:15, we sat around the campfire for about 4 hours, telling stupid stories and other things. But now it's getting too real. We started to feel like we were being watched, which was strange because we hadn't seen anyone in the area for about a kilometer. So we thought it could be a camper nearby. So I yelled, "Hey!" But there was no answer. So, we just didn't care. I woke up later that night to the sound of twigs breaking. I was curious, so I looked out of the tent. I saw something about 20 meters away from the tent. In the moonlight, I could only see that it was about 8 feet tall and had dark brown hair. So I woke my friend up, and he looked very pale. He slowly closed the tin zipper and looked at me and said, "It's right outside." I told them that couldn't be true since it was only 20 meters away. To get started. My name is Doug, and my father and I are what you would call hunters. And when we hunt, we know what's in the woods. So, we went to West Virginia to hunt for black bears. I was just getting back to camp after an early morning bear hunt. My dad went hunting for the afternoon, and I knew where he was in case I needed to find him. Well, he gets to his spot and stays there until the sun goes down. Then he starts walking back to the side by side. On his way back, he went out to get to his spot. He heard footsteps, but this was in the mountains, where only hunters and a few locals know where they are. The footsteps he heard were neither human nor bear. He stopped for a moment, then kept going. Then, from behind him, he heard the most terrifying and powerful scream, and he thought, so this is how it ends. Well, if he gets to the side by side, it will be one heck of a race. And as soon as he got inside, something ran up and threw a huge rock at him. When my dad got back to the camp where I was waiting for him, it was the first time I had ever seen him scared. He didn't come out of the camper until it was time to leave, and we left with no further incident. When we go back, let me start by saying that this isn't my story. It was told to me by a friend of my grandfather's a few years ago. So the memory might be a bit hazy and it may not be scary to most people, but I thought I would share it anyway. Also, if there are any mistakes in the story, I'm sorry. I was getting over a concussion when I wrote it. This story happened in upstate New York. For privacy, the friend of my grandfather was hunting with just one other person. I won't mention anyone's name in this story. Anyway, they came to a road and decided to go in different directions. He sat on a rock and waited until about 4 o'clock. But at this time, nothing showed. He decided to meet up with his friend, and as soon as he got off the rock he was sitting on, he saw something walking in the woods across the clearing, not far from him. The thing came out of the trees with its right side facing him. He didn't know if it was a bear or person or not, so he wasn't sure what to do. He decided to whistle at it after that. The thing walked away from him on 2 legs and went back into the forest, where he couldn't see it anymore. It then walked back out of the woods, this time facing him. They stare at each other for a moment before the thing walks back into the woods and out of sight. My grandfather's friend walked back down the road away from what he saw, where he saw his friend walking up to him. He asked him if he had been down to the place where he saw the thing. He said that to this day, he has never gone down that way. He says it couldn't have been a bear because it would have fallen over on two legs, and it couldn't have been a person because they would have told him they were there. He says it was for sure a Bigfoot. This comes from someone who heard it from someone else, so you can decide if it's true or not, but I hope to find out what he saw. What I'm going to say is very real. I've never told anyone before, but now I am. Back in 2003, this happened to me on our family farm in Ohio. It was the middle of October, and my dad and I were on our way to the farm, where we always went hunting for deer on the weekends. We got there at 5:45 a.m., and we sat in the truck talking and joking about who was going to see more deer or shoot the bigger buck, as we always did. At 5 to 6, we got out of the truck, put on our gear, and headed toward the woods. As we entered the woods on the left side of the cow pasture, I had an odd, creepy feeling, which I guess was normal for me because the woods always gave me that feeling. Since I was a kid, my dad walked me to my tree stand and made sure I got in and was safe. As always, he wished me luck, and I told him I'd be back at noon. Then, he went to his place. A few minutes after he left, I felt like someone or something was watching me with an overwhelming tingling. It was still dark at this time. I started to look around the trees to see if I could see any shapes, but I couldn't. I was starting to feel very overwhelmed by the feeling that everyone was looking at me. It's been a few minutes since I last looked at the trees. I tried again, now that my eyes were used to the dark. Better, I looked to my left, then slowly to my right, and there's nothing there. I tried calling myself, and telling myself in my mind, it's nothing, you're fine. I hear a crash coming from my left, and my heart sinks. When I looked, I saw a few deer running as if for their lives. They keep blowing through the woods, as I can still hear them crashing through the trees. I can only see the silhouettes and outlines of the trees at this time. I thought it was strange, but maybe a coyote or something else was after them, so I didn't think much of it. About 5 minutes later, it's still dark, but dawn is getting closer. I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and that creepy feeling comes back. My heart starts to beat very fast. I can hear Abby crunching leaves and loudly snapping sticks from the neighbor's property, which is where the deer ran from. On the left side of our woods, there are more than 100 acres of switchgrass and hundreds of acres of other woods. I look up and see what looks like my dad walking toward me. It's getting lighter outside, but the woods are still pretty dark. I waited until the person I thought was my dad got 20 yards or more away from me, and then I asked him quietly, "What are you doing, Dad?" No response. It keeps walking toward me, so I say, "Dad, what are you doing?" A little louder. And still no answer. I started to say, "Hey, buddy, you know you're trespassing." But I didn't hear anything back. When it got to the tree where my deer stand was, I realized it wasn't my dad, and I started to get scared. I look across the woods to where my dad's tree stand is and see his flashlight climbing up the tree. That's when I looked down and saw something standing right under my tree stand and staring at me. Whatever it was tall enough to easily reach up and grab my foot. I'm 14 feet up in this tree. I started to cry out of fear, and my heart was beating so fast and hard that I thought it would burst out of my chest. I made a weak, muffled cry. It just grumbled at me and walked away in the same direction as the deer. I watched it go into the woods as the night was quickly getting lighter. Once it was gone, I could smell body odor mixed with the smell of death, an old hound dog, and trash. As the morning went on, the woods were completely quiet, with no birds, squirrels, or deer to be seen. Nothing. I've never heard it be that quiet in the woods before. Once I was calm enough to get down from my tree, I ran to my dad and told him I didn't feel well and wanted to go home. So we left. When I was 15, this happened to me. Now that I'm 29, I've never hunted in our woods again in the morning. Even now, I won't be there after dark, but I haven't told anyone until now. I do not smoke, drink or do drugs. Never have. I promise. This is a true story, and in tonight's episode, it's the scariest thing that's ever happened. We talk about 5 scary encounters with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or what other people thought was a wild animal in the woods. These include finding footprints in the winter and having rocks and logs thrown at you. Let's start with the first story. I was born in Oklahoma and have lived there my whole life. I grew up hunting, fishing, and doing everything else you could want to do in nature. My whole family is like this, and I taught my boys to be the same. But I've never been one to believe all the silly stories people tell about Bigfoot and other silly animals that live in the woods and are said to exist. That is, until one day when my oldest son and I went fishing at one of our favorite creeks. In June of 1999, it was a beautiful, sunny day, so we decided to make the most of it by packing some food and going fishing. Just dad and son, so we packed up everything, got our tackle box and fishing poles, and headed out. We live a little bit outside of town, so the creek we were going to is about a 20-minute drive from our house. When we got there, everything seemed fine and lively. Even though it was June, the water in the stream was still very cold, which is great when you've been walking around in the hot sun. This spot is a pretty normal creek bed, but there are a lot of bushes and other plants all over the area. And I mean bushes that are about 6 to 7 feet high. It's not open and clear at all. So, to fish, you have to find a nice place along the riverbank. We found a good place to sit, and we started unpacking our food and setting up our tackle box and poles. As I sit there and help my son, I've noticed that he's not paying attention to what we're doing. Instead, He is looking over my shoulder with a very confused look on his face, as if he is not paying attention. I thought that was strange, since fishing is my son's favorite hobby, and I never lose his attention for anything else. So I turned my head to see what he was looking at. I thought it might be a bear or something, but I was wrong. About 30 feet away, a face peeped out from behind a 5-foot bush and stared at both of us. It looked like a person, but it also had a Neanderthal look to it, with hair all over it and a head that was more like a cone. The cheeks were bare, and the skin looked like it was made of leather, but the whole face was covered in hair. I couldn't really see any pupils in the dark eyes. Its nose was like ours, not like a gorilla's. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. When it saw that both of us were looking at it, it quickly lowered its head. My son freaks out and asks what in the world that thing was doing looking at us. I was getting a little scared, too, but I just wanted to think that someone was playing a trick on us with a stupid Hollywood mask. So I yelled, "Whoever you are, get out of here. I have a gun on me," and this thing bolted out from behind this bush and into the woods about 70 to 80 feet away faster than I could have ever imagined. Now, I want to remind you that it's the middle of the day, so we can see everything pretty well. It was about 5 to 6 feet tall and had a lot of hair. I mean, I'm talking full black hair. If a black bear could walk on 2 legs and run like a person, you'd be pretty close, except for the cone-shaped head and the lack of a neck. It looked like it didn't have much of a neck, and its arms moved back and forth. It also had a barrel-shaped body and was made like a tank. It ran without looking back, and I've never seen anything or anyone run so fast. It was gone as soon as it hit the wood line. My son couldn't stop thinking about what we saw for the rest of the day. I told him we'd talk about it later and to just try to enjoy our fishing trip for now. We didn't fish there for very long, though, because he didn't like it. So, we got in the car and drove back home. My son is out of it and asked me if we had seen a Bigfoot. I told him that Bigfoot doesn't exist and that someone must have been playing a joke on us. Looking back, I was very naive to think that I had seen an adult Bigfoot. When I told this story to some friends who are interested in Bigfoot, they told me that I probably saw a young Bigfoot because it seemed more curious and playful than it ever did territorial or aggressive. I'm not scared anymore, but whatever it was very weird. Now that my son is all grown up, it was strange for me and him to see what it was. He still goes fishing in the same spot, but we haven't talked much about what happened and I haven't brought it up since. This is a story my grandfather told me about when he was a kid. His family has owned property in Texas for a long time, and he and his father used to hunt there. As of right now, our family had moved to Minnesota, and we've been living there for a long time. We don't even go to the old house anymore, and we haven't been there in a long time. My grandfather has been hunting since he was a boy, so he is pretty good at being in the woods and doesn't have much to be afraid of. Even now, when I hear about this event, it gives me chills because my grandfather still gets scared when he talks about it. My grandfather hunted all kinds of animals, like deer, coyotes, squirrels, and so on. They had a lot of land to use. He had a lot of free time, so he could really get to know the woods around him and get a feel for the animals that lived there. There are even wild turkeys that run around there every now and then. So there was a lot to hunt all through the season. At the end of this particular day, he took a path he didn't usually take to go to a part of the property he wasn't used to. Both he and his father had several paths they could take. They would leave their property to go hunting in different places. After going maybe a mile, he started hearing strange sounds and vocalizations in the woods around him. At first, he told me he thought it was a bird, but he said there are no birds in the woods that sound like these noises did, and they would come and go. So at first he kind of ignored them, but then they got louder and more frequent. But my grandfather isn't afraid of anything, so he kept going. After maybe another mile, he started to smell a strong skunk musk smell that was said to smell like rotting meat and skunk. My grandfather said it was like finding a pile of 100 dead, rotting skunks baking in the sun. He said it was so strong, there'd be times it was hard not to want to gag and vomit. He said that he kept looking around but didn't see anything. At this point, he knew something was wrong because he felt like he was being watched. He couldn't find any sign of the smell, and as time went on, things got creepier. He also told me that as he explored the area, he sometimes came across things that didn't look quite right, like markings that didn't look like they were made by people, like they might have been made by animals or something. He told me that he had found smaller trees that had been dug up, turned upside down, and then put back into the ground. What's scary is that this happened in the 1940s, when their property was pretty big and private. No one would have been on their property doing something like this, and if they were, who would have the strength to pull all these small trees out of the ground and then drive them back in? This really freaked me out. My grandfather also thinks he found a small den of whatever he smelled. He said he found a small cave opening that led to a cave that he thought was about 30 square feet. But it smelled like a dead skunk, which was where it came from. He also said that he could see bones from the entrance of the cave, so he decided it was probably best to go home. Even though he thought they were deer bones, he didn't want to take any chances. He told me that as he was leaving the den, he felt an overwhelming sense of fear and had to get the hell out of there. At that point, people started throwing rocks at him, and I'm not talking about small pebbles. I'm talking about rocks as big as tires being thrown through the woods about 10 to 20 feet away from him. He was so scared because it was clear that this was enough. He ran away and got back home as quickly as he could. He said that whoever was throwing rocks at him had to be very strong and couldn't have been a person. He said that when he was leaving the den, he heard some kind of stomping and screaming sounds. Something was trying to get him to leave the area, and it wasn't far away. He told me that there were more than one of these things not even 50 feet away, but after that, he couldn't see them anymore. He still hunts on his land, but not nearly as much as he used to, and he has never gone further than where he used to. He kept moving to new places. His father never talked much about it, and I guess that's because there wasn't much to talk about back then, and if he did, you'd think he was crazy. When his father died, the house went to him, and not long after that, he moved to Minnesota for work, which is the third story. My fiancée and I love to camp and do things outside all the time. We usually like to hike and explore a lot. We've been on a lot of different trails, hikes, and had a lot of fun out in the woods. I've never seen anything weird or out of the ordinary, but I'm a firm believer in the paranormal, Bigfoot, and other strange things that do happen. However, I've never really experienced one of these things until the event I'm about to tell you about. We chose to camp at Lake Dewey in Michigan, which is one of our favorite lakes. We've camped here a few times before, and every time was great. So we thought that this time wouldn't be any different. It was later in September, and I remember that it was still pretty warm, but the air wasn't yet cold and crisp like it is in the fall. We had a typical day of fun at the lake. We hung out, went hiking, and hung out in our tent before going back out and hiking again. After dinner, we came back to relax for the night, but by the end of the first night, my boyfriend was acting strange. I thought he was tired because he was getting very quiet and not talking as much as he usually does. We did have a long day, since it was. We put out the fire in the end and went to bed for the night. I could tell he was nervous and had trouble falling asleep, but he didn't say anything. Even after I asked him if he was okay, I went to bed right away. When I woke up the next day, I felt well rested and ready to face him. Not really. He didn't look very good and still seemed tense from yesterday. After getting up, eating breakfast, and going on the next hike, the day seemed pretty normal, so we decided to get ready to go back to camp because it was getting later in the afternoon. When I asked him what was wrong, he just said he didn't like where we were and felt like we were being closely watched. I told him he was just crazy and that it was silly to think that nothing was out there and that nothing was going to hurt us. I talked him into staying with me one more night, but he was so nervous about it that it bothered me how strange he was acting because that's not how he usually is. He's usually one of the first people to think of crazy hiking trails and places for us to check out. He was always the first one of us to want to explore dangerous places and things that weren't meant to be explored. This night was a little calmer, and I think we both went to bed a little earlier than usual. My boyfriend just laid there trying to sleep while I stayed up and thought about running on my cell phone. It had been a pretty quiet evening. After we got back to camp, we didn't talk much because it was kind of boring after he told me what he did earlier. I was a little on edge, but I tried to ignore it. If I remember correctly, it was pretty late at night. I think my phone said something like 11:32, and this is when we started to hear heavy footsteps in our campsite, and then breathing. I started to feel very uneasy, and every time someone walked, I could hear a thud. I started to get scared because I didn't know if what we were facing was a bear or someone who wanted to hurt us. I turned to my boyfriend and asked, "Did you hear what I heard?" He was as white as a ghost and just nodded at me. I sat there, scared, looking at the door of my tent and trying to listen for any sound I could. After a while, I could only hear the sound of the night air. The stomping would stop for a few seconds, and then it would start again. Whatever it was stomping around in circles around our tent, but it wasn't really getting into any of our stuff like a bear would. It seemed like it was checking out our tent or something. Whatever it was kept coming closer and closer to the tent, and we could hear it breathing heavily. It sounded like a 10-foot tall man, so it must have been big. Either that, or it was a bison on 2 legs that spent the next few hours walking around our campsite. This would go on and off until about 3 or 4 a.m., when we could finally go to sleep. We didn't even notice when the noise stopped and the fear went away. I think my boyfriend and I fell asleep because we were too tired and scared to stay awake. We still don't talk about it, and when we woke up the next day, neither of us said a word. We just got out of there as fast as we could and packed up. From what we saw and heard, it could have been a Bigfoot. It's possible that someone was going through our camp. I have no idea what it was. I don't think I'll ever return to that lake again. For as long as I can remember, my brother Travis and I have gone hunting together. Our paw, God rest his soul, used to take us when we were little. He always told us how impressed he was with how quickly we were able to figure out our surroundings and notice things like tracks, markings, and sounds. It went well. We didn't start going hunting with him, though, until we were about 9 or 10 years old. And we fell in love with it right away. When we were about 17 and 16, respectively, our paw died of cancer. Since my younger brother is only a year or a year and a half younger than I am, things haven't been the same. So, my brother and I try to hunt together every year as a way to remember that and keep the tradition going. It's important for the family line. Our uncle has some land that has been in the family for a long time. My brother, Paul, and I have been hunting there for a long time over the past 5 years. Specifically, we had been hunting in other places, and it just wasn't the same as hunting on our uncle's land. So we decided to try it again this year by going back to our uncle's. We talked to him and got the all clear. We got there early in the morning, and luckily there were several tree stands set up all over my uncle's property. He has more than 80 acres of deep woods. We are in Montana, after all, and there is a really nice cabin-style house where we sometimes stay before going camping. This time, we knew we wanted to go to our usual tree stands, so we got there early in the morning and got ready to go. It was clear that my brother would take a stand about half a mile from where I was. We were both going to go about 2 to 3 miles deep into the woods to get to this one spot we both knew about. It was a pretty good clearing, and there are usually a lot of bucks and does here. So we knew that this was the best place. We got up and went to where we were supposed to go. We had to get going. Both I and my brother wished each other luck. Once I got there, I climbed up into my tree stand, sat down, and waited. When I get to my tree stand, I usually just want to chill out and be comfortable. I like it. I love it. I belong when I'm out in nature and hunting. And I've always been so calm. The sun was just about getting through. It couldn't have been later than 5 or 6 in the morning. I can't say for sure. I thought it was strange, though, that I didn't see much wildlife in the area as we hiked back to these stands. Even though an hour had passed and nothing had happened, I didn't think much of it at the time. The woods were strangely quiet, and all the animals had left. I mean that there was no sign of anything. I thought it was very strange. After a long time, I started hearing strange sounds coming from the woods. I couldn't really figure out where it was coming from near me. I could tell it was coming from close by. I thought at first that it was a big buck finally passing through the area because it sounded so heavy, and I could hear branches breaking and brush being crushed. The only problem is that the heavy thudding and steps I heard didn't sound like they came from an animal with 4 legs. It sounded like a heavy person, but it was way too heavy to be a person. I started to hear what I can only describe as whooping noises and other strange sounds. I began to feel anxious. As the sounds got louder and louder, I looked out of my tree stand to see what was making them. I looked right at it. This big, hairy man was just 50 yards away from me when he walked into the woods from the clearing. I quickly ducked my head down to make sure it didn't see me. Every step it took was a deep thud, and I could hear it wheezing and breathing hard. I could hear it walking toward me, and as it got closer to where I was standing, it slowed down. I was so scared that I had no idea what to do. I tightened my grip on my rifle and prayed I wouldn't have to use it in this fight because I knew I wouldn't be able to beat this thing on my own. It moved slowly around me and kept going. I waited until it was completely gone before I moved a muscle. It felt like an eternity. I quickly opened the hatch, got out of my stand, and ran to my brother's stand, which I knew was only half a mile away. I knew it wouldn't be too far, and if I could get past the thing that walked right under my stand, I would probably be fine. The woods were still quiet, which made me very nervous because it meant that it was still in the area. I probably only took 10 minutes or less to get to my brother's stand. He also looked like a ghost. I told him what had happened, but he didn't have much to say. He just told us to leave, so we ran out of there as fast as we could. I've been hunting for a long time, but I'd never seen or met anything like what happened that morning. When we got back to the truck, my brother told me that he had seen the same thing walking near the history stand and that he doesn't think it saw him or meant any harm. He might be right. But it's something I don't ever want to happen again. It really scared me to death, and I haven't been able to hunt on my uncle's land since my brother got over it and moved on. He won't talk about it, though, and we've found other places to hunt since then. I think we've all decided that we don't want to go back. Even if it's an unspoken rule, whatever is going around with my uncle's property should stay away from me. Story 5. When I was in my early 20s, I loved to go out and explore as much as I could in the winter. My favorite time to go hiking was in the fall. It was all so wonderful. And even though it was cold, the weather never made me want to leave. Even though most people in that time never went outside, I always dressed for the weather. My favorite thing would be to drive down all the band and logging roads and just stop and start exploring. Most of the woods around there haven't been touched, so those are usually the best parts. I like to go out and explore in almost every season, but winter is just so different. I don't hunt or work in the woods for a living. I just like to hike and explore. But I have a lot of good friends who love being outside and hunting. Now, No matter what time of year it is, there's always something to see and do. I often bring weapons with me, like elephant knives and such, in case I run into a bear, a mountain lion, or anything else that could put me in danger at this time. As I was looking around, I found what looked like very large tracks down by a small frozen river a few miles into the woods. I've always been pretty open-minded about Bigfoot, but it was amazing to see this for myself. I'm not sure if anyone else comes out this way, but if they do, I doubt they'll leave a fake footprint on the ground. This was an old creek bed that had dried up and looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The footprints looked like they had been there for a long time and been frozen. I think the impression of the footprint as a whole was what really got to me. You could tell it was set pretty deep into the frozen ground. Now, these footprints weren't exactly in the snow. Instead, they were in an area where the snow was melting but the ground was still completely frozen. Since it looked like the footprints had been there before the snow, you can tell that whatever made this or these footprints was very heavy. The footprints were easily 16 inches or longer and only had a little bit of fading, so they were pretty well kept, but I think that was because they were put in a cold fridge. It was interesting to see that the footprint had no real arch and 5 clearly defined toes. It was clear that it was made by a 2-legged animal. I looked at the footprints, which were scattered along the riverbank and led into the woods. Even more crazy is the stride. The distance between the tracks was about 5 to 6 feet. What on earth would walk like that out here? I didn't even want to try to figure out what it might be. I thought about following the footprints, but that seemed like a bad idea right away because I didn't know what animal made them, and they were going in the opposite direction of where I wanted to go. I like to explore, but I'm not stupid enough to put myself in a potentially dangerous situation when I don't know what I'm dealing with. I don't make molds of tracks, so I don't have any casting materials with me, nor do I ever carry them. It just so happens that I ran into these tracks. After a while, I went back to my car and drove back home. I couldn't get it out of my mind. There are a few close friends of mine who are big fans of Bigfoot. So I told them about it, and they were thrilled that I had told them. Not only did they say I found Bigfoot footprints, but they also told me about scary things that happened to them in those same woods. I don't know if Bigfoots really exist or not at this point, but I do know that those footprints are hard to explain and I don't know what animal made them. We're glad you watched this video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe to What Looks Beneath, leave a comment, and hit the like button. All of these things help my channel grow. Also, keep an eye out for whatlooksbeneath.com, which is coming soon. On that site, you'll be able to send me your own scary story and have it read on this channel, where thousands of people will hear it. We have a lot of great things coming up in the near future, including new merchandise and a weekly podcast series. Fans, stay tuned. I've never really thought about Bigfoot or any other animal that people say doesn't exist but I know doesn't. That was until the fall of 2005, when I went camping. Mount Adams in Washington State was the place I chose. I do things that aren't very moral and could hurt most people. Most of the time, I start at a trailhead and then go completely off the trail, using only my compass to find my way back. What I do, I was pretty good at. So I knew that the idea of the whole thing didn't bother me too much. I remember that the leaves were just starting to turn colors, so this probably happened earlier in October. I remember hiking for a long time. On the first day, they set up camp. The next day, they got up and walked another 5 to 7 miles before slowing down and going to bed early. At this point, I had probably hiked a total of 12 to 13 miles, and I wanted to make sure I rested a lot tonight. The nice thing about where I set up camp was that it was only a couple hundred yards from a large creek. This let me use water for more than one thing, like cooking. The rest of that night went pretty normally. The stars were out, and the sounds of the forest could be heard. It was great, and I didn't wake up until the next morning. I woke up around 5 or 6 a.m., I think, to some strange gibberish chirping sounds coming from about 200 feet away. If I had to make a guess, the sounds seemed to be far away, but they were close enough that I could hear some of what was going on. It sounded like people were talking as fast as they could while on speed. It was the weirdest thing. I remember thinking to myself, why would there be anyone out here? I'm at least 13 miles from the beginning of any trail. I just laid there though with my eyes shut, trying to drift back off to sleep. But this gibbering sound is all I could think of to call. It kept going on, and I finally got curious and wanted to see what was going on. So I got out of my sleeping bag and poked my head out of the tent. Now, from where my head sticks out of the tent, I could see the creek pretty well, and there were enough trees and bushes around that I was kind of hidden. I guess you would say like if there was a bear or some predator at the creek, I don't think it would necessarily see me. But again, I had a pretty clear view. I remember I looked over in the direction of the creek and I was stunned by what I saw. There were two humanoid figures, I guess we'll call them. One was black and extremely hairy. The other one was almost a pale white, with a little bit of grey. The pale grey one was taller and bigger than the black one. Judging by the rocks around them, I would say the black one was about 5 to 6 feet tall and the pale grey one was about 8 to 9 feet tall. The pale grey one was obviously much larger in girth and overall size, even the muscle mass was a huge difference between the two. I couldn't really make out any faces or anything other than just seeing these large shapes, but I remember hearing the gibbering noises go on and it sounded like it was coming from them. They were moving their arms around like they were lost in conversation with one another, and they were literally standing right at the bed of the creek. I was in such shock and disbelief and so bummed out. I didn't even have my Kodak camera or anything to take a picture of these things with. I was pretty sure what I was witnessing was two Bigfoots having a conversation or something like that. Although I don't know if you could really call that conversation. It was just these weird, high-pitched, gibbering noises that I guess would be their communication. I'm not sure how long this went on, but I watched them because I was curious. I never sensed any fear or felt anything bad. I just watched them sit there, move their arms around, and talk to each other. Before I knew it, they were out of sight, but the gibbering sounds and noises kept going on. Although I could tell it was moving farther and farther away. It's really crazy to me because I know that the Pacific Northwest is supposed to be known for Bigfoot, but I never actually ever believed in that, and I didn't think I would be running into any of them at all in my camping expeditions, let alone two after they left. I got back in my tent and got everything ready to go, and I actually tried to head back to where I came from just in case I didn't want to wander into their territory or anything like that. I don't know what kind of animals they were, and I didn't want to be aggressive with any of them, even though I wasn't scared at all. I think this whole thing taught me to be more aware of my surroundings and to be open to the unknown, even though there are things out there that aren't supposed to exist. I saw with my very own eyes, two of those things. I don't know if Bigfoot are supposed to be a type of people or an animal or even supernatural, but whatever they are, I must have been close to maybe a den or a village or whatever it is that they migrate and live in all together. I've told my experiences to a few friends of mine, and they actually tell me that it sounds like I encountered an elderly Bigfoot talking to a younger juvenile Bigfoot, which I thought was extremely interesting. I guess white and grey. Bigfoots aren't as common, but I guess they are seen from time to time, and I don't know if it's because of their age or what it is that causes them to be that color. But then it was also interesting to see a shorter one, which would make sense that maybe that one was a juvenile, that was talking to an elder one. Maybe that really did mean that there was a village nearby or something similar. I don't know for sure, but it would make a lot of sense since Mount Adams seems to be a popular place for Bigfoot and UFO sightings. I later on found out, and like I said, I was at least 10 plus miles off of any trailhead. It would be impossible for really anyone else to be out there in a big hairy gorilla costume of any kind. There's no reason anybody would travel 10 plus miles out in the middle of the forest to do such a thing. And for what reason, not to mention those Bigfoot sounds were just not human. I'm here to tell you about a few different Bigfoot or Sasquatch encounters I've had in my life. From getting rocks thrown at me to this thing running at my trailer to meeting it face to face when I was in my early 20s, I'd say I was about 25. I had just bought my first RV, and I thought it would be fun to take it to some of the California mountains. Now, I took that son bitch everywhere. I want you to know that I lived in that thing for a long time, and it was my baby. But there were a few times when I thought strange things were happening, or that maybe there was a strange presence outside my RV, if that makes any sense. When I was sleeping in my camper one night, I heard little pop, pop, pop sounds coming from my trailer. This is the time I remember most clearly. Then they got louder, heavier, and started to sound like thuds. Then I saw that rocks and pebbles were being thrown up my trailer. What's going on? I thought I was alone in the middle of the woods at 3 a.m., and I ran out of my trailer to look around. It's completely dark, and the only thing you can see are the stars. There's no one around, and the only sound you can hear is crickets. I don't know what on earth was hitting my trailer, but when I went to the side where I heard it, there were rocks and pebbles all along the bottom of the RV. Along with getting a little dizzy from all the rocks being thrown, something or someone was throwing rocks. I want you to remember that things like this have happened to me all over California. There wasn't a single place where these things did or didn't happen. They would just happen from time to time, some worse than others. There would be times where I'd be hiking out in the woods by myself and I would hear wood knocking screams and other really strange sounds that I couldn't quite explain. Actually, if you get on YouTube right now and type in Bigfoot screams, I think there's a piece of audio from Eastern Oregon. At least, if you listen to it, I think it sounds a lot like what I sometimes heard in the woods, along with the knocking of wood. When I was hiking alone another time, I'm pretty sure I accidentally ended up in their territory. I remember that I had gone by a few, well, what they probably meant as markers. These were trees that were literally ripped and uprooted of the ground, turned upside down, and broken apart and in pieces. It was the oddest thing to see. If you want to know what I'm talking about, all you have to do is go to Google Images and search for Bigfoot markers and Bigfoot upside down trees to get an idea. I didn't believe that those things could happen like that. But unfortunately, when you come face to face with these things, it's an unfortunate reality. After I had walked a little ways past these markers, I heard nothing in the woods around me. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. I was right next to a ridge, and something in my gut told me to look up. At the top of the ridge, maybe 20 feet away from me, was the biggest Bigfoot I could have ever imagined seeing in my life. This thing was gigantic. It was very big. Not only did it have the biggest barrel body I've ever seen, but it also looked like a silverback gorilla on steroids. I'm talking about something that was easily 9 to 10 feet tall and so wide that I couldn't even measure it. The muscles were huge on their own. But the thing that scared me the most about the whole thing was the way it looked at me. Its face looked a lot like that of a Neanderthal. It had a strong brow ridge and big nose and lips. They were dark, but not completely black. About 25 feet away, I can sort of see them. This thing just stared me down in a scary way. Its whole body language and way of acting showed that it was standing its ground and protecting its territory. If I had to describe how it looked at me in one sentence, it was pretty much telling me to go. Now, you better believe it. I wasn't going to try to fight an animal this big, no way, no how. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you these small details, and in the future I might send you a very detailed account of what happened to me in Colorado. What I'm about to share with you now is my actual father's encounter that he had back when he was in his 20s. Yes. When I say my actual encounter, I'm talking about what I know about my father's real Bigfoot sighting. Growing up, he told me about it a lot, but I thought it would be cool to share it with you guys in a Bigfoot encounters video. So this is my father's encounter back in 1973. It was close to summer. This happened on the edge of Davie, Florida, where most of the land was still undeveloped except for the thousands of acres of orange groves and citrus fruits. At the time, the news talked about a skunk ape. Those of you who know more about Bigfoot and Sasquatch will know that the skunk ape is the same creature that is often seen in the Florida Everglades. Even now, people still see them often. I was at my cousin's house in the Everglades. He lived in a house that was used by the groundskeeper for the orange groves nearby. At the time, there was only one road, about 25 miles long, that went east and west from Highway 27 to Alligator Alley. I was with my cousin Gary and 3 close friends, as I said. It was about 8 o'clock at night, and it was pretty dark outside. We were just hanging out and talking when out of nowhere our nostrils get assaulted by this foul-smelling odor. I could only say that it smelled like a strong, grotesque musk. I've smelled skunks in my day. And even though the smell was just as strong, this smell was very different, but it still smelled like a wild animal. We were scared by the smell because it made us think of skunk apes, which have been in the news a lot lately. Let me show you how the property is set up. On all 3 sides of my cousin Gary's house were orange groves that went for miles until they reached the Everglades. Aside from that, he had a long front yard with a driveway that went right to the road. We started hearing commotion and rustling out in the orange grove. We all got up and turned on the outside lights when the smell started to get stronger. I think it was coming from the darkness near the house. Whatever it was in the back of the property. It was outside of the yard's range of light, and it was hiding in the dark because it didn't want to be seen. We all got guns to protect ourselves. We had rifles and handguns. We were ready to take this thing out. My cousin had an elephant gun with a big bullet. He also had a .30 caliber machine gun, semi-automatic as well. Someone had a .22 and someone else had a .357 Magnum. We ran outside to the backyard to see if we could spot anything. We couldn't see anything because there was so much darkness. We yelled at it and teased it to come out, but nothing happened. After a few seconds, we heard a very large branch break. I'd say it was about 10 feet away from where the light stopped. This thing was close by. I'm not sure what it was, but it was smart enough to stay out of sight. We were loaded up and we're going to kill whatever it was. Had it been there? After that, everything went quiet, and the smell went away. We stayed outside for a few more minutes, laughed it off, and then went back inside to continue the night. We stayed the night, and the next morning we wanted to check out the tracks to see if there were any clues or other things like that. What we found the next morning was a 10 in diameter branch ripped straight from the tree exactly where we had heard the branch ripped last night. This was ripped right off the tree by something strong. But things start to get a little more interesting. Soon after that, my brother Dominic went into the Everglades to look for something. He was probably looking a few miles away when he found a cave that he thought was a big animal's home. It was said that this den was about 10 feet across. He said that he found bones of different animals and a very bad smell. Whatever he found scared him enough to get him out of there as fast as he could. We don't have bears down there, and the Everglades don't have any predators that would live in a place like this. He said that this den was so well made that it scared him to death. And he knew a lot about mountain lions and other dangerous animals that live in America and even Florida. During this time, there were also reports that a horse had been found nearby with its head completely torn off its body. We all heard about this report, and my brother put 2 and 2 together and said, this is him finding the den of whoever ripped the horse's head right off. Now, tell me what the hell could be strong enough to pull a horse's head off its body? Do you have any idea how much strength and force that would require? I haven't had anything like what I told you about because Florida has changed a lot since the early 1970s. It's possible that a lot of the area where we met the first time is no longer there. It makes you wonder what's really waiting for you out there. Over the holiday weekend, I camped with my wife and daughter. We both took off work on Friday and went to meet up with some friends who were camping with their kids and dogs for the holiday weekend. They were already out there and had found a nice place for our whole group to camp. Just a spot off of a service road with some makeshift fire pits. It wasn't an official campground. There were 10 of us in total, 7 adults and 3 kids in their early teens. We were camping south of Mount Rainier in Washington state, just outside the park boundary off a road that led to a locked gate that let you into the park. We knew there was a locked gate at the end of the road because all the cars that went that way turned back because it was only open to national park staff. We set up camp on a flat area that was big enough for the 2 tents they had set up for us before we got there. It was a little closer to the road than their tents, which were set up a long way back. Once camp was set up, we hung out with our friends while the kids played and ate dinner around the fire. It was just friends hanging out, having drinks, and sitting around the fire, and everything was great. We stayed up pretty late, and by the time we went to bed, everyone was tired and cold. Slowly, everyone went to sleep in their tents. My wife was cold, so she got in the car to warm up. After that, she fell asleep in the car. Now, my daughter and I are the last ones to wake up by the fire, and she decides she wants to sleep with my wife in the warm car. I agree that it was okay, since I tried to wake up my wife and get her to come sleep in the tent with us, but she was already sound asleep. So I watched her go to the tent and get her blanket and sleeping bag for my wife. It was getting cold, and I had already turned off the car. She got the things, zipped up the tent, and went back to the car. I stayed up a little longer by the fire, and when I woke up, I was sitting in a camping chair by only glowing embers. It was pitch black, and only the coals of the fire were glowing red. In the middle of the night, I got up and found my way to the tent. I climbed in and went to sleep. I was so tired that as soon as I got into my sleeping bag, I fell asleep. At about 3:30 in the morning, I wake up to the sound of my daughter's tent rustling and what sounds like 2 women talking very quietly. I tried hard to hear what they were saying, but I couldn't really make out what they were saying. There were no clear words coming out. There was just mumbling and then nothing. I thought it was just my wife and daughter finding their way to my daughter's tent. They didn't want to wake me up by being loud, so I thought my wife was just going to sleep in the tent with my daughter. But now I'm upset because my back hurts because the air mattress has lost all of its air and is now flat. And all I can say is that it is dead quiet. I can hear things breaking or popping like sticks. So I think the fire is still there in some way. Then I hear something moving around in front of my tent, but it stops when it gets close. There is something right in front of my tent. I can feel it, I can sense it. So I slowly stood up and sat down. I heard something take a big breath in and a big breath out. This is the deepest breath I've ever heard, and it was followed by a very loud huff that sounded like it came from a horse, cow, or some other very large animal. I was frozen with fear as I tried to figure out what I was hearing. And it quit. I only heard one deep breath in and out, a huffing sound, and then nothing. The next thing is an owl hooting. Just a short distance away from the back of the area. Our friends got tense, and then I didn't hear anything else, no sounds of fire popping, sticks breaking, or anything else. I stayed there, sitting up and being frozen with fear for what seemed like forever, until I could see that the sun was coming up and it was getting light. Now I got up the courage to go outside and look at the ground in front of my tent. That's when I saw that my daughter's tent was open and empty. I got scared and ran to the car, where I found them fast asleep. I don't see a single track or anything else around our tents, and everyone else is in their tents about 20 to 30 yards away. Now I'm freaking out like crazy. Whose voice did I hear? Who was hanging out near the tent? What the hell was that breathing in front of me and puffing outside my tent? What opened my daughter's tent zipper? There must be a reason why. And I spent at least an hour out there getting the fire going. As soon as our friends got up and started moving around, they slowly made their way out to the fire, and I asked them where they had been all night and where their dogs were. You let them out, right? Where did they come from? Why were they smelling around the tent? Did anyone wake up and find that we were talking or moving? And, nope, did you hear the owl? They all said, no, no, and no. I don't know who or what was whispering and breathing and huffing right in front of me. Who the hell woke up in the middle of the night and opened my daughter's tent? I saw her close it with a zipper and walk to the car. That breath and huff scared me so much that I couldn't move. After I heard it, I didn't move at all. I sat there as still as I could, not even wanting to breathe. It was one of the scariest times of my life. Something big and unknown was right in front of me in the darkness, and the only thing between us was a thin tent wall. All of this happened between Friday night and Saturday morning, and we still have one more night here. I decided that I won't sleep in the tents tonight or ever again. Neither will my wife or daughter. The rest of the day is great. We hang out, eat breakfast, go into Ashford and take a hike down the road to Lake Cora. Other than that, we just camp and hang out. It's getting late, and even though the sun is out and the sky is blue, the canopy in our camping area is thick, so even at the brightest part of the day, it was still pretty dark compared to the road area. As we're hanging out, we hear whoops in the distance and wonder what that was. More time passes. And some of the people who were at the camp when we got there have already left. We were down to just 7 people, and 2 of them were almost always in their tents. So, only 5 of us were left to hang out by the fire. When it started to get dark, my friends started making dinner for all of us while we sat there in the woods between us and the park boundary and down toward the creek. Everyone heard these blood-curdling screams and wood-like howls. We all stopped talking and went quiet. Then we all looked at each other and asked, what the hell was that? About 4 or 5 times we heard this. It sounded like a woman was being killed. What kind of sound was it? I'm not sure. I know that a cougar can sometimes sound a lot like a woman dying, but this didn't sound anything like that. Then a few knocks on trees came from about the same direction. Is someone trying to mess with us? Everyone was thinking, keep in mind it is a holiday weekend. So there are a lot of campers in an area of 15 miles. So I called my friend over, but he hadn't heard the screams because he was cooking on a skillet and had There are loud propane lanterns in front of and behind him, but we can't hear it when we stand there and listen. We decide, okay, we'll do a tree knockback closer to the road that separated us from the area where we heard these sounds and knocks. When we heard it, I got a chill all the way down to my core, and the hairs on my arms and neck stood up. Both of us looked at each other and asked, "Did you hear that?" I asked him what he heard, and we both said it sounded like monkey and gorilla sounds that you might hear on the Discovery Channel or something. It was like a hoo-ha sound, but it was far away and deep and rumbling, not like what you hear on TV. I want to say it was like it was aimed right at us. I always say that because the other people were sitting behind us, maybe 10 feet away, but they didn't hear it. Now, we're freaking out and no one is sleeping in their tents. We don't want to say anything and scare everyone else because they're already on edge. I've been hiking and camping with my family and friends in the Pacific Northwest for almost 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. I am 39 years old and grew up in the ghetto on the East Coast. I have been shot at and chased. I used to be an infantryman in the US Army. I spent many nights in a dugout or sleeping hole with just a sleeping bag. After this weekend, I'm afraid to ever sleep in a tent again. I've only really been scared like I was that first night and during the rest of my time in the forests out here when I was a kid back home. I'm Brandon, and I'm from Alabama. This story takes place in 2008 or 2009, when I was about 14 years old. I don't think I was that young. I lived with my grandmother and grandfather at the time, but I'm not going to say why. So, we started to move, and we did things in the yard like put grass around the house. A few people helped my grandfather and grandmother while my brother and I played in the street and took care of the house. It wasn't a very big house, but it was big enough to have a deck and a small patch of woods at the back. So, my brother and I were just playing, and I don't know why, but I had the feeling that something was wrong in the woods behind us, like something was watching us from there. I could hear the sounds of moving leaves and branches. It could have been the wind. Maybe not. Maybe 40 or 50 minutes later, we were pretty hungry and thirsty, so we ate and then went back to playing. Then, when we got back, we played for about 10 minutes. I forgot about the woods completely, and the sounds I had been hearing stopped. I stopped and just looked around to see if there was anything I could see. I walked over there, not right up to it, but close enough, and there was still nothing there. It's as if whatever was in there just stopped. I got scared easily, so I didn't want to think about it anymore. I left and didn't go back behind the house. The next day, there was almost no grass left around the house, and the sun was going down, but I didn't remember to stay away from the back of the house unless I had to. When I was playing, I went behind and stood there. I felt like there was something else there with me. I looked to my right and saw a big animal or something that looked like a werewolf or an upright dog staring at me from the ground. After a few seconds of standing there, I ran to the front of the house to tell my grandparents what I had just seen. Well, neither of them didn't believe me, and they both told me to keep playing. So I just sat in front of the house for the rest of the time thinking that was what it was. I still have no idea what it was or even if it was there. Before I moved there, I thought I heard things in the woods, and sometimes I even saw things. Things really started to pick up around 2010. See, my best friend lives on the edge of a small town not too far away. As the crow flies, it's only about 10 miles away. There are a lot of trees and thick brush. It's mostly private land that's not open to the public. Both ways, the nearest neighbor is about a quarter-mile away. One night, the girl who was going out with my best friend had just left his house. They were all having a picnic outside in his front yard when he threw an apple out there. He took one bite, but it was too sour for him, so he threw it away. The next morning, he was cleaning up his yard when he went to look for the apple he had accidentally left behind and saw that it was gone. He didn't think about it very much. He thought maybe an animal had taken it. In the end, only one apple was there. He threw it away because he knew that animals would come and eat it anyway. He often left food out for deer and other animals to eat far from his house. A week later, when he got home from work, there was a dead fox on his porch. It looked like it had been strangled to death because its eyes were literally popping out of its head. He said that the kill was recent, and he didn't know if someone was just messing with him or what. Then he looked over at the dead fox and saw the same rotting apple that had been eaten once sitting next to it. He started to panic and was sure that someone was messing with his mind. Despite that, he didn't call anyone. Instead, he stayed interested and waited to see what would happen next. Nothing else happened as time went on. I just told you about things that happened in September, before it got cold. So let's move on. About 6 to 9 months until the next spring, when it was starting to get warm again. When he was having dinner with his girlfriend at his house one night, she started yelling that there was a big, hairy man in the front yard. He took off and flew to his door. About 50 feet away, in the front yard, there was a big black mass. He said it like this: it was just standing there. His eyes tried to focus on it and the evening twilight, but they were drawn to what it seemed to be holding in its hand. It looked like a dead raccoon, and it was a pretty big one. He couldn't see a face, clear features, or anything else that would help him describe what it looked like. but he said that it seemed to be looking right at him. This thing moved quickly behind a tree nearby. Once it realized he was looking at it, he said this creature seemed to be about 5 to 6 feet tall. If he had to guess, he would say it was really big and hairy. Over the next few days, he just knew that what he had seen outside his house was a Sasquatch. As he thought about it more and more, he became convinced that this creature was the same one that had left the dead fox and the apple with a bite out of it on his porch the year before. Since he first said this in his front yard, he hasn't seen or heard anything else like it around his house or anywhere else. Hello, I'd like to share a few short stories with you. All of this started when I was about 12. I'm 19 now. Jade, who was my age, and Maddie, who is my sister's age, were camping with their mother, who was my sister's stepmother at the time. We had been there for only a day, but everything was fine. Then, my sisters and I decided that we would go to the stream on our own. My dad gave us each a walkie-talkie so we could stay in touch while we were away. Now, where we were going was surrounded by bushes, and we had to go through them to get there. To get through it, you had to go down a small path. We had been splashing around in the water without our shoes on for a while when Jade said she could see something standing among the trees. When we all looked, we saw a person. Even though it was black, you could tell it was a man. The face couldn't be seen. We looked at it for a few seconds, but then it was gone. We forgot about it and kept playing in the water, but I was a little worried. We all turned around after a while to see if he was still there, and he was. It was quiet everywhere. I could hardly hear the little stream's rapids. We stopped looking. After about 20 minutes, we turned around and went back to our campsite. The forest and all the sounds around us had stopped. My sister's group was about 20 meters behind me, and we couldn't see each other. I heard a branch break behind me, so I turned to see if they had caught up. No, I turned around and saw the tall, dark black figure standing right behind me. It was only a foot away, so I started running as soon as I felt it close behind me. I ran as fast as I could until I was out in the open campground and it was gone. My sisters came out not long after I did, and I told them what had happened. I asked if they had seen it, but they were too far behind me to have seen it. Anyway, the path was windy, so they were usually around a corner from me during our camping trip. We didn't see it as often, but sometimes we would just see this figure standing there watching us. Fast forward a few years, and we go back there with my father's new girlfriend and her daughter Stella. I don't remember as much about this trip, but I know for sure that Stella saw it too. Bigfoot sightings come in all shapes and sizes, but tonight's special episode is about the Lake Dewey monster, which many people in the area of Michigan believe is either another Bigfoot or something even scarier. This episode has 12 encounters from this area that show the monsters that live in the swamps and the wilderness. There are a few examples of stories that say they have drawings and pictures. If you want to see this for yourself, you can just go to Google and search for the lake drawing monsters as well as the lake. Imagine the pictures from the last story to get a better idea of what these people saw now. Story 1, on a Friday night in late August, a number of people called the sheriff's office to say they had heard a big explosion. One call came in from the gas station at the 5 Mile corner. The other call came from a pay phone in the same general area. The police were sent to the area after a quick search turned up a small fire with smoke coming from it. They followed it to a lonely spot on Pre Street where they found a car that had flipped over and was on fire. The fire spread to every part of the car. The fire was tried to be saved, but no one was seen inside. Even though the fire burned the car to the ground, it was put out in the end, and the area was blocked off while the deputies did their investigation. Eventually, the police found out that the car belonged to a man from South Bend, Indiana. He told them that his brother had taken it soon after. Someone in the area, Mildred Whittingmore, called the police. After getting into an accident, the two teens were at her house. The police talked to the couple. Roy Townsend and Jay aren't both from Hillsdale and were both shocked. They eventually said that they had been sitting in their car for some alone time when something attacked it. They said that the car was pushed forward and then flipped over, and that they had to crawl out as something started smashing the car. Mr. Townsend said that at first, it seemed like they had been hit by another car, but he didn't know why. Townsend said it was like a bear but looked like a big man, and then he started smashing his car. MS don't show that Townsend ran away from her at first and left her there, but when she was later found running back to the highway, she said she was still very angry with him and even more afraid that this thing would catch up to them. They ended up at Whitney Moore's house by accident, and she was very nice to them. At first, the police didn't believe the teens and thought they were trying to hide the fact that they had crashed the car. But one of the officers with multiple jurisdictions, Paulie Jones, who was at the scene, saw a tire drag mark just over the edge of the hill. When Officer Jones looked more closely, he wrote down several important things. First, the skid marks went all the way over the small hill. This showed that the car's wheels were locked and that it was moving slowly as it went over the small hill. Second, the tread marks at the point where the car turned over were clear and distinct, showing that it had been lifted instead of suddenly going airborne. Third, if the car had turned over because the driver lost control at a high rate of speed, it would have gone airborne at the top of the hill instead of when it was going down the slight slope at the time. Jones was made fun of by the other officers. Also, his immediate supervisor told him that his observation didn't matter and that it wouldn't change the outcome of what Town said. He didn't get hurt physically, but they didn't get along when they parted ways. Officer Jones said that the next morning when it was light outside, he looked around the area and wrote in his report that the brush and grass that led to the woods and the lake had been moved by something. He also said that he didn't find any footprints, but he added that the ground is full of crabgrass or stones all the way to the water. There wouldn't be elephant footprints there. Story 2. 4 friends from Chicago were coming back to the Twin Lakes cottage their parents had rented for the month late one September evening in 1962. They were coming back from Grand Haven, where they supposedly went to see a musical fountain open for the first time. After driving for about 2 hours, they were about 15 minutes away from Twin Lakes as they drove along Dewey Lake Street, a gravel road that wasn't paved. As they slowed down on a narrow gravel road between a swamp on the eastern part of Dewey Lake Road, their headlights suddenly fell on what Randy Times said looked like a giant tree growing in the middle of the road. Emails showed that Terry Jones stopped the car and thought about what to do. Jones remembered that the tree then turned around and looked at them. The animal was taller than them when they were standing in the road. Then it just walked over to the swamp on the north side of Dewey Lake Road, walked into it, and vanished. The girls were screaming so loudly that they didn't stop until we were almost back to the cottage, Jones remembered. I was worried about getting past that thing, so I didn't stop, but I do remember seeing it walk into the swamp, and into the dark. Randy Emays thinks of I really wanted to go back the next day when it was light out, but I was afraid to get stuck on that road again if it came back years later when I was up there on vacation. Even though the road was paved by then, it didn't matter. Even in broad daylight, that place was scary. Story 3, in late September 1962, on a Sunday night 5 children were playing in Glenwood, Michigan. After watching their favorite TV shows, they got together around 9 p.m. to look for the legendary lunar moth. They were about to split up and go home because they had to go to school the next day. When Jamie Shaw ran across Dewey Lake Street the next day, he was looking for what he thought were fireflies. Mark Miller, one of his friends, reportedly told him, "Those aren't fireflies at this time of year." Still, Jamie followed the faraway embers into the swamp. The rest of the friends keep playing for a while. Katie Keene's mother eventually started calling to her. The time had come to go home. Then they realized that Jamie had never come back. She remembered that I had asked her where Jamie was, but no one knew. He never made it back from his hunt for fireflies. At first, no one was worried, but when we called and looked for him and couldn't find him, Katie said, we told Mrs. Howie and Mrs. Shaw. Soon after, everyone in the small neighborhood came out and started looking around with flashlights, just like Harry Woods. Someone in the area was about to call the police. Jamie was crying and curled up in a weedy area near the swamp when they found him. Katie Keene remembered that we were scared because we didn't know what had happened. We thought he had been attacked by someone or was dying or something. Jamie later told his parents a story. He said that a big hairy man attacked him, hit him in the ground, and threw him across the street. Jamie Shaw skipped 3 days of school. When he did, he told his classmates about what had happened. The school principal later talked to Jamie's dad about the back injury. Mr. Shaw told the principal that the cuts on his back came from what happened the Sunday night before. Same story that Jamie had told them. Ms. Sally, Jamie's teacher, said she did not believe him at first. But after talking with Jamie during recess, he was sure that something had attacked him and thrown him around. Say Lee said, "I'm surprised he didn't die, his bruises were so bad." On Wednesday night, October 31, 1962, Story 4 was told. Betty Garson was taken back to her home in Chicago, Illinois, from Detroit, Michigan, on the evening train. The train had already gotten off to a late start, and as it approached the dog kayak, it slowed down and stopped at the remote Dewey Lake Street crossing in Glenwood, Michigan. The train stopped there for about 15 minutes while people checked out the debris on the tracks. As I looked out the window to the northwest into the dark, Miss Garson supposedly saw what looked like a giant stump or faceless tree step out of the thick woods and move toward the tracks. The figure then just stood still and looked at the train for a few minutes. Emily Clark from Chicago and Roger Wentworth from St. Louis, who were also on board the MS Garson, heard about the sighting and confirmed it. After a moment, the figure moved from the edge of the trees toward the train's caboose, which was sitting in the dark on the rural tracks. Most people agreed that the figure was about 10 feet tall and weighed between 700 and 1,000 pounds. When the hulk disappeared into the darkness at the back of the train, a porter was called. But at that point, the train started to move again. A metal-on-metal sound was heard near the back of the train, and it was thought that this was because the train had started from a cold start on the rural tracks. The train kept going until it finally stopped in Chicago without any more problems. But when the train got to Chicago's Union Station, passengers who were leaving noticed a big hole in the last car. Miss Garson told the Chicago what she and the other two witnesses had seen. P.E. Many people think that the Garson train sighting sketch, which is based on what she told the CPD sketch artist about the monster, is the best way to imagine it. The sketch was just in case, while the urgency of a possible emergency was looked at. After the first statements were taken, a sketch was made, and the situation was thought about. It was thrown out and sent to a different department. Chicago had a lot of trouble in the 1960s, and Miss Garson said that the Chicago Police Department didn't take her seriously. She said that they told her she had to file a report with the city, county, or state in question. As the event happened outside of their territory, the federal government would not have to get involved. They told her that they were too busy with real crimes to look into the monster sighting in Michigan as a joint venture. The case was never looked into anymore. Fifth story dog IX school system students had a good time at Fitch Camp at the end of the school year. The students would take a break from their regular classes to do things outside. Parents and students both liked Fitch Camp because it was a fun way for kids to spend time together and because it was in a unique part of southwest Michigan, between the sister lakes. The kids were able to play in a peaceful place. Some of the kids went to the makeshift archery range after the races. After the activity, the students were told to go straight to the mess hall for dinner. Denise McCormick and Janine Fisher, however, went to get an arrow that had gone astray. About half an hour later, Denise and Janine came to dinner late, and sat with their friends Rhonda Burdick and Stacy Ashley. Denise and Janine told their friends at that dinner that when they were looking for the arrow, they saw a huge, smelly, hairy man staring at them. They said the man was really big and just stared at them, so they ran. The story spread, and by the time Denise and Janine went to bed that night, everyone was laughing at them. That was, until someone attacked the cabin where these same girls were staying. Stacy Ashley said that something started hitting the side of the cabin. Rhonda Burdock said, "I thought it was going to smash the wall." We were all yelling, and Janine was thrown out of bed. The camp counselor wasn't there, but later it was thought that she was the one who had hit the side of the cabin to scare the girls. But the next morning, after she washed away what she thought were fake footprints in the mud leading up to the side of the cabin, she saw that the footprints were real. Susan Howell was surprised to see cracks along the foundation on the side of the cabin. "As soon as I washed away the footprints, I wished I hadn't." She took Polaroid photos of the cabin, but another camp director told her that they didn't show anything. But 50 years later, all of the girls who were there still say they saw and were attacked by aliens. Errol and Sally Cunningham had been married for 32 years when they were 6. They had a cottage in Dog Eck, Michigan, on Cable Lake and Sister Lakes. They liked their cottage, but by the late 1950s, the area was changing quickly. The couple liked the way the development fit in with the natural beauty of the lake area. In the early evening on a Friday, they drove up to their cottage in the middle of July and settled in for a week. Ms. Cunningham went out to her backyard, which looked out over the lake, to enjoy the early evening. She then saw something on the other side of Cable Lake. Her husband came out and joined her outside. They saw an animal on the far shore, so the story goes. Errol Cunningham said, "Look at that." Sally Cunningham and her husband stared at the thing for a long time. "We couldn't figure out what it was. We couldn't really tell what kind of animal it was because of the distance and the weeds," says Sally Cunningham. "It then got up. She said that the thing seemed to be staring right at us. She said, 'I'm not sure what it was. I'm not sure if it was scarier that the big animals stood like people or that they seemed to be looking at us.'" Errol Cunningham told the Chicago Sun-Times, "I think we were just curious until it took a step into the lake toward us. Then it started walking toward us in the water. I was afraid, so I brought Sally inside." Mr. Cunningham said they talked about what they had seen and what they should do about it when they got back to the house. Errol told his wife that he didn't want to call the sheriff about something they thought they had seen. Instead, he decided that the teens in the area were playing a joke. Sally and Errol then went to their back porch to relax with a drink. But things went horribly wrong when, instead of watching the sunset, they saw bubbles floating down to their beach. At this point, Carolyn and Sally went back inside to call the police and report something strange. Sally and Arrow spent a lot of time thinking about what to say to the police so they wouldn't think they were crazy. But when the sun started to go down over the lake, I knew something was very wrong, Arrow told Sally. She looked out the window at the beach. I dropped my phone and ran over to see what it was. It was a big thing with long arms, standing on our beach. It was wet and shining, and it just stood there looking up at our house. Cunningham told Sally that many years later, we ran to the car. Errol turned around and walked away, but that thing was already standing behind us. Errol drove away, but the car wasn't working right. We heard a loud crash and scrape, but we kept going. Sally later said that when we stopped back in Lockport, we saw that the bumper was gone. There was something supernatural about that thing. After they sold their cottage, they never went back. At first, neighbors called to say that there were loud noises, but when the Cunninghams were asked about it, they refused to talk about it. It wasn't until 1972, when the Cunninghams had moved to Florida after retiring. Did they tell a former neighbor who still has property in southwest Michigan why they moved away and why they left? Sheldon Stein later proved this to be true when he did research for a Chicago vacation home circular. Seventh story. R.J. Lute's friend Harold Underhill asked him to draw this picture. This is a picture of the animal that Lute saw while fishing at the south end of Dewey Lake early on June 22, 1963. Lutz was fishing for perch in the dark before dawn when he saw a large triangle-shaped object bobbing on the surface of the lake in a remote area. He moved toward it because he thought it might be the head of a big snapping turtle. But when the sun came up and lit up the water, he saw a big log coming out of the triangle. He slid up to it and was curious when he saw that the log was red and had hair on it. Let's say he said that he didn't know how a cedar tree got in the water and then reached out with his oar to turn it over. When the things touched the log, they stood up in the water, revealing a large animal. The animal, which was about 10 feet tall, made a clucking sound that got louder and louder until it was so loud. It hurt a lot. "Let's recall," he said. The animal then glared at him, slid back underwater, and swam away like a crocodile. Lutz didn't know what the animal was, but figured it was probably something that didn't belong in Dewey Lake. His friend Harold Underhill said that Lutz made him laugh and said that he was a drunk. But let's paint a picture for Underhill and keep the story true until he died in the early 1980s. Story 8 happened on a hot, muggy night in late July 1963. Alan Razik and Bob Ford had to pull their canoe through weeds and mud to get to the water. With the canoe on our heads, I thought we were going to get stuck in the mud. We knew it was a mess, but we didn't know how bad it was until we got there and saw the thick, black, deep mud. We were told it would be worth it, though, because it wasn't fished out, dirty, tired, or covered in sticky weeds. They put the canoe into the black water by sliding it into the water. You couldn't see anything below the water in that lake. Alan Razik told the Cass County Sheriff's Office that a mist had settled over the lake and that we expected the fishing to be very good. Like an old horror movie, there was a thick fog. Ford said that even the flashlight would go out. We had only been on the water for a few seconds when the water started to splash. We sat down because we couldn't see a thing. The boat then started to rock. Then there was a bigger, louder splash. Then we heard a sucking sound, followed by a loud, angry roar. Razik stated. We sat there in silence, trying to figure out what the hell was going on and what to do. Then we heard something breathing like a bowl. We could see something over by the sound, and I can make out a big black shape. We start paddling like hell, and Razik is said to have pulled the canoe out and run back through the weeds to Moore's truck. They were in a hurry when they loaded the canoe, so they didn't secure it well. Less than a mile down the road, they had to stop and clean up the canoe, which had come loose and broken in the road. Jim Casey was on his way home when he ran into them. He said it was strange because he had just seen a mess in the road. Then I talked to them, which was strange. Two tough old birds in Mud Lake are talking about this thing. Casey said that every time I drove my Mud Lake, I did think about it twice. Razor told his daughter years later that what happened on Mud Lake was the strangest thing that had ever happened to him. He also told her to stay away from lakes like that. They have something in them. 9th story. A month after the canoe was destroyed on a road in Twin Lakes and a monster was seen on Mud Lake, another canoe was found broken on the bottom of shallow water on the south side of Picture Lake. But this time, the person who owned it disappeared. Stan Red Roberts was staying with his friends Philip and Roger McPhee, the son of Philip. While Reed was in town from California, the McPhees drove down from Lansing. Red had been having money problems for a long time, and Philip. McPhee later told police that he was afraid to have Red stay with them because, after joining them in the rental on the lake, Red always asked to borrow money. Red and Philip had a few beers, then Reed decided to take the canoe out on the lake. Philip said no because he wanted to go to bed early so he could take his son fishing at dawn. Philip went to bed in the morning. He and Roger got in a rowboat and put out on the lake. Philip didn't see Red or the canoe and thought he might have fallen asleep on the lake. On Picture Lake, I knew they didn't have a motorboat, so I wasn't worried. Not much can really happen out there. Philip had told the police that nothing was happening with the fish. Philip remembered that there wasn't a single fish in the lake. I was so upset that there were no fish. I just kind of forgot about everything Red. Philip was only worried when he got back and didn't see the canoe or Reed. I have to be honest. At first, I thought Red had stolen something and run away. But by early afternoon, Philip was worried and went back out in his rowboat to look for Red. I thought he might be on the other side, maybe bothering some neighbors. But Philip remembered that he had seen the canoe before he was even 100 yards from the shore. It was sitting at the edge of the lily pads on the bottom of the lake, where the water was clear. At first, I was angry because I saw a big hole in the bottom of the canoe. I thought he had been drinking with some people he met and they had gotten out of hand. Philip called the sheriff, who sent out the deputy. The canoe was pulled out. Philip had to pay for the broken canoe, but Red was never found. A nearby tourist helped get the bag, and then he or she spent the rest of the afternoon looking around the area. Paul Wozniak, a retired Chicago police detective, turned out to be the man. Later, he showed her how to put together the pieces of the canoe that were scattered among the weeds, mud, and trees. It was hard to get to because the water got shallow and there were a lot of weeds. Not dry enough to paddle through and not hard enough to walk on. In a letter Wozniak sent to the Herald Palladium on August 27, 1963, he wrote about how excited he was. What follows? The pieces I found showed me that the hole was made by a single force exploding up from the bottom. This was especially true because there were no broken pieces right under the canoe or in the canoe itself. So Philip, there is no other way to describe what happened. Red was lost to history. Story 10. Leon Brosnan and Danny Peterson both liked fishing a lot. They had heard that Gear Lake was a great place to fish, but there was no public place to put in. Still, they were able to get permission to pass the boat on early Wednesday after school. Leon and Danny were excited to try out their new heads-on lures. Leon laughed at me when I used a steel leader on my lure. I told him I didn't want to lose it, and he said that's only for sharks. What Danny said. Leon Brosnan said that they were using a heavy test line, which was way too heavy for fishing in inland lakes. However, we had always dreamed of catching a 25 pounds bass. So it was a good idea. I didn't know that it would be too light. What happened is still hard for me to believe. What I saw shocked me. Leon saw that Danny had thrown his line with the steel leader toward the north edge of the quiet lake. The red and white bobber didn't move at all on the calm water. I remember we were kind of getting disappointed. We had worked so hard to get to the lake, but nothing, not even bluegill or perch, would bite. Danny remembered that we had brought Cokes and bologna sandwiches. I went back to get the food and talked to Danny on the way. When I saw Danny's face change, I jerked my pole and then sat back down. Leon lost his mind. Holy crap! Was all he could say. Over and over. As it turned out, Danny's eyes were huge. When he pulled in his line, he saw that the steel leader had been eaten through. Leon showed me the end of the paddle, and said that he saw a mouth as big as the paddle come over the bobber. The mouth bit through the line and jerked the canoe before breaking the line. It was a big mouth that came over the barber's head. It was covered in hair, and I thought I saw eyes right before it went back under. Leon later told a D.N., our representative, what he had done. Then, later, the D.N., our guy said it was probably a garfish. Leon said, I've been fishing all my life, and I've seen gar. Wasn't a garfish. Danny Peterson later said, I wish I had been there to see it, but I just couldn't get over how it bit through that leader. It must have had sharp or strong teeth. Story 11. Elmer Polemic worked for National Motors Auto Specialties for more than 20 years before he retired in 1963. He spent more and more time in the woods near his house off Griffiths Road in Casa Policia. So, his neighbors weren't surprised to see him walking through the Newton woods with his green backpack on, but it was shocking. Shortly after that, Elmer stopped people from walking toward Dorgaya Creek and told the Smith family to call the sheriff. The sheriff was called, and deputies came to check out the reported body. After looking into what was said to have been found, police took away the bones, which showed that it was more than one dead deer. But Elmer Polenic told the police and the people who had gathered that he saw a big red-haired animal as big as a truck leaving the pile of luggage. Elmer said the animal barked at him and then walked west into the creek. Helen Smith, who also talked to Elmer, said she believed what he said. You can't fake an answer like that. When Elmer came up the path, he was a tough guy, but he was shaking and sweating. The witness said that the deputies at the scene told him that the dead deer would be taken away and that the woods were open. Still, the family who talked to Elmer didn't stay in story 12. Davis. Garrett's 18th birthday gift was a new Nikon camera. He liked to take pictures. He had a dark room at home. On Halloween, he was in charge of taking pictures for all school events and the yearbook. Davis and his 3 friends went to Picture Lake for a party. Garrett and his friend Dominic Emery saw a commotion on the west side of the lake as the sun started to go down. Garrett started to take photos. Then they saw a big animal throw a log halfway toward them. Garrett and Emery turned around and ran back to where they were meeting. When they got back to the group, everyone was quiet because they had heard the thing scream so loudly that it hurt Emery's ears. Emery said that a group of us took flashlights and went over there, but we got scared and ran away. The fun is over. Garrett stated. When Garrett got the pictures developed, they seemed to show a large, ape-like creature about 10 feet tall walking along the edge of a swamp. It is now called the Picture Lake picture. Thanks for coming to watch. If you liked what I wrote, leave a like, comment and don't forget to click the subscribe button. I'm going to start putting out a lot of content every day, so keep an eye out for more dogman encounters, Mothman chupacabra, UFOs, gargoyles, swamp monsters, camping in the middle of nowhere, and other cool things. Stories paranormal, black-eyed get ready, kids and everyone else, because this summer is going to scare you. I am an avid hunter. My name is Bo, and all my life I have hunted and fished. Right after high school, I joined the army, and now I work 6 days a week. But enough about me. You all want to know what real nightmares are made of. I learned this while hunting in New River last October. I had gotten up early that day and made my fiancée breakfast. My fiancée loves fried eggs in the morning, and I make them just the way she likes them. After we eat, I get my camel and rifle out of the bag and cabinet. The next morning, we left, and I drove my fiancée to work. When we get to New River, where her work was, she gives me a kiss and tells me to bring her something good to eat. I told her I would, and when I got back in my lifted Chevy 2500, she was happy. As usual, the trip to the mountain was beautiful, and the back roads in Tennessee are amazing and beautiful. So I got to my stand, but it was so quiet that morning that I went back to the truck around noon to get a sandwich and another bottle of water. I ate a peanut butter and syrup sandwich. While I was getting ready, my boyfriend made me. She even took the time to write me a note in which she told me she loved me and was glad we were together because we were only a month away from having our baby girl. She was just a wonderful old lady. After I was done, I decided to walk back through the woods to the tree stand again. I start to worry that something is wrong, that something doesn't seem right. But I ignored it because this is hog country and I thought it might just be nerves. I've been chased before on the road I'm walking on, but this just kept getting worse. I started moving farther down the ridge toward my stand until I heard a branch break, which made me stop. Now, I'm a seasoned hunter, so I could see movement in this thicket about 50 yards away. I saw that this brown shape was coming toward me. So I got down low and got my gun ready. When I heard this thing grunting, I pointed my gun at the color. So I'm thinking, yes, a rich god. Was I mistaken? As the thing slowly moved closer, I realized, wow, this thing is so big that it's much bigger than a deer walking on all fours. So I'm thinking, okay, the elk is walking out fine, but then I look at its head and see that it's not the right shape. It starts to slowly walk out, but then stops and stands up. I mean, it's easily 8 feet tall on 2 legs. But because I'm 66 and the thicket is just above my head and this thing is almost a foot to 2 feet above it, it starts sniffing the air and turns its head right toward me. At that moment, I freeze up and feel like I'm stuck to the ground. The wolf-like thing I was looking at started to let out a deep, almost demonic-sounding growl. It started to snarl at me and show its teeth. I was trained in the army, so I knew that if it charged, I'd only get 1 shot at it, so I'd have to make it count. Suddenly, it started tearing through the bushes on all 4s. Again, I saw that the werewolf in the movie Van Halen is coming at me at full speed. I knew I was in a lot of trouble when I heard a branch break behind me. I look over my shoulder and see a second, bigger wolf standing behind me on 2 legs. It is easily 9 feet tall, built like a bodybuilder, and has jet black fur. It drops to all 4s and starts running full speed towards me. This one, though, was much closer. I turned around and saw that this thing was moving too fast for me to safely shoot at it with my rifle. I jumped out of the way of this huge beast that was coming at me. I hit the hard rocks and slid into the red clay mud, only to find that it had already crossed the road bed. I've been walking on, and the 2 wolves are headed for a collision. When the bigger black wolf hits the lighter brown wolf, he tackles the brown wolf to the ground as they roll down the hill, clawing, biting, and slamming into the hard ground. The smaller brown wolf kicks and stops at the bottom when the big black wolf's stomach is ripped open by its back claws and he is thrown to the ground. The brown wolf then looks at me, snarls, and charges at full speed again. As the wolf comes toward me, I am amazed by how strong it is and how big it is. But the big black wolf hits the brown one from behind, running its arm through the brown one's side, picking it up, and clamping its huge jaws on its shoulder as it throws the brown one away from me. It lands, rolls for about 10 yards, and then jumps up and runs back into the brush. I let out the breath. At the time, I didn't even know I was holding it in. I look at the bloody, beaten, and torn open black wolf, which is standing with blood dripping from its back claws and the brown wolf's blood dripping from its white teeth, and for some reason I realize that I need to show the king of the mountain that I am not a threat. I lower the rifle away from me, and as I do, this thing smirks at me and lets out an ear-shattering roar that turns into a howl as it looks into my soul. I see the eyes of a beast, and I know they are there to show that it is the leader. As long as I treat him with respect, he won't be a threat. It turned around, went down on all 4s, and ran after the other one. I start running right away, which was good for me and the army because it helped me stay in great shape. I get down from the ridge and reach the truck. As soon as I get to the door, I see that the side of my truck is covered in blood. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I took the safety off the rifle so I would be ready to shoot anything that jumped out of the truck bed. I saw that a big, dead doe with a broken neck was lying in the back of my truck. I jump in, turn the key, and spin the truck around, sending gravel flying in 2 directions. I'm ripping my behind out of the woods and flying down the mountain on back roads. I don't stop until I get to March. My fiancée can see that I'm upset, so she takes me home. I share everything with her. But we decided to tell everyone that I hit a doe with my truck and was scared because no one would believe me. That is, until I heard that other people had also seen this huge animal. So, I thought this was the best way to tell the story without getting told I'm crazy, lying, or making it up. I just wanted to let all the hunters and hikers know that we're not at the top of the food chain or the king of the mountain. The king of the mountain is a huge animal that has no natural enemies. Again, thanks for letting me talk about this. Now, I'll tell you about the second time I met him. I have a Bigfoot story in which my fiancé and I both saw the same wolfman. We went out again to look for a new river. Since 3 or 4 years ago, we've seen a family of Bigfoot. They've never been mean or anything. They are respectful and usually very interested. There are 4 Bigfoot around. The big male is almost 10 feet tall and completely black. He looks like a jacked hair man. The second biggest is an 8-foot tall female that is light brown, and has black stripes running down her shoulders and back. The 2 shorter ones are between 6 and 8 feet tall and have a lighter brown color. One is a boy and the other is a girl. The young male is dark brown, and has a patch of lighter brown on his chest. The young female is a beautiful shade of light golden brown. We usually see them as a family or 2 males hunting together. This could be because they have both been on deer trails or gravel and dirt roads to get around the area. All of them are very interested. They have been known to walk up to me and my fiancé and yowl and chirp at us from about 50 yards away. It's been fun to see them and get them used to us being there. We built a cabin in the valley at the bottom of the ridge. This cabin in the woods is near a beautiful spot between 2 creek branches, but we can drive right up to the door. We first saw the male, which made us nervous because it's not too far from where I'd seen the 2 dogs fighting. When we first started seeing the whole family, they would check out the truck or look through the windows at night to see if we had been cooking there for a while. They scared my fiancée at first, but then she realized they were just curious. On hot summer days, it's been amazing to watch the kids play in the creek. The big male was lying in the cool mud, and the big female was resting in the shade, while the 2 young ones played in the mud by splashing, rolling, and even throwing it. When the young man ran up behind me while I was fixing a tree stand in the back of my Chevy, he scared me with his loud steps. Then he let out an odd whoop, almost like he said boo as much as he said woo. I jumped around because I was scared, and the young man was standing there laughing like a little fat guy holding his stomach, like a backwards Satan laugh. I made him laugh and told him, "You little shit." The big man walked up to him and grunted. He gave a wave and took off. When my fiancée heard the sound, she went out onto the porch and waited to see them again. Since it was the second time they had been there that morning, she has seen me and the big guy standing about 10 yards apart. He dwarfed me. I saw her face, and it looked like she was scared or at least nervous. It was strange to see him so close that I could smell his skunky scent. Last weekend, I saw that he had a new open wound on his chest. It was like 4 big claws were digging into his thick, leathery chest. We left some fruit that was going bad out for him so he could get to it easier so he could heal up, because it showed me that he would protect the area this weekend. We went back up, but they were nowhere to be heard or seen. I was kind of afraid that something would happen to him and cause trouble for his family. So, I kept looking for them all night long on Friday, but I never saw them. My fiancé and I got up the next morning and had breakfast. We went hunting just a little ways up the ridge and had a great day together. We've always been together. I found her even more beautiful because she liked to hunt. I really can't believe how lucky I am to have her. As my partner and I got back to the camp Saturday night, we saw that the leaves all around the camp had been moved. It gave us some hope that they're all going to be okay. Then we got ready for dinner and started cooking in New River as the sun was going down. It gets pitch black dark. In just a few seconds, my fiancé went out to the porch to get me a bottle of Jack from the truck. I heard the truck door open and slam as she ran through the door, so I dropped everything and ran to make sure she was okay. She was standing there saying that she thought our big male neighbor was coming up the creek bed towards us, so we turned down the camp stove so we could go outside and watch him come. So, as we stand there, I light a cigarette and hand it to my fiancé because I like my own. I noticed that he is walking funny and doesn't sound good. His normal grunts, which are strong and clear, sound more deep and raspy. I took the bag of fruit out of the back of the truck, and we walked closer to the creek bed. We then crept back up the creek bank toward camp. The animal is getting closer to me, and I didn't realize it, but I stepped into a hole where one of the young ones had thrown a clump of mud. I hit the ground hard as I was stepping backwards, and I got up quickly, trying not to scare away the Bigfoot. My fiancée turned around and helped me get up, but when she turned her back on the animal, my heart sank as I saw the deep, pitch-black wolf man who had beaten her. Its huge body jumps through the creek at an incredible speed, so I put myself between the beast and my old lady, the love of my life. I didn't want anything bad to happen to her. So I put myself in front of him and charged at him, yelling this primal roar I never knew I had from the deepest part of my soul. As soon as I got his attention, the wolfman jumped out of the water and ran full speed towards me. I pulled a Bowie knife out of a sheath my grandfather had kept from the Vietnam War, knowing I was going to die because he would kill me. Suddenly, a roar comes from the top of the hill, where the young female was roaring and beating her chest. When the wolf stopped, so did I, because I could see a new animal trying to join the fight. My fiancée stops on a dime, and she was looking at me with tears in her eyes when I realized she had taken the hunting rifle from the back of the truck. The wolf starts to snarl and growl. He knows he's in trouble, so he pushes me away and puts me on my back. My boyfriend pulls the trigger and shoots him. The bullet hits him in the chest, but it doesn't do much damage. As my fiancée ran up to me with another gun and gave it to me, we saw that the young female and young male across the creek started throwing rocks at the wolfman. I started backing up slowly toward my fiancée as the big male burst out of the thicket and jumped over the creek, and the huge male standing between us and the wolfman was roaring and beating his chest. The wolf starts running once more. The alpha wolfman and the big male Bigfoot got into a terrible fight, with the wolfman clawing and slashing the big male, who was standing there with his head held high. He grabbed the wolf by the neck and held it back while the two kids threw rocks at the wolfman. The male Bigfoot hits the wolf with its huge arms, bringing it to its knees. At the same time, the wolf cuts the Bigfoot's legs, bringing him to his knees. Both the Bigfoot and the wolfman fell to their knees, and when the Bigfoot did, it let out a painful yell. He is jumped on by the wolfman. Then, one of the other big feet swings a downed tree, and hits the wolfman right in the head. As it flips backwards, she swings, breaking the log across its stomach. He jumps and starts to run. As she kneels down to the male, the female makes soft chirping and clicking sounds. The kids crossed the creek to meet up with their parents on the other side. My fiancé comes running to me, hugs me, and holds me while saying, "Thank God." The big male got his bearings by standing up and looking at me from about 10 yards away. He did this light chirping and clicking toward me while tilting his head like a dog would to make sure I was okay. The whole family was standing there in front of us, and my fiancé and I, along with the whole Bigfoot family, all let out this huge, ringing roar at the same time. It was sort of like a roar of victory. Then they slowly climb back up the hill to the top of the ridge, where I think their cave is. My fiancé and I go back to the cabin and go inside. She checks me out, wraps my ribs up, and we load the truck faster than ever. We get out of there with my fiancé's Jack 2500 Chevy holding my hand and telling me she's so proud of me and just glad I'm okay. As we sped down the mountain, every bump made me think of my bruised ribs. When we got to the main road, I thanked her for coming back to get me. She leans over and gives me a kiss on the cheek, and then we get the hell out of there. Hey, guys, what's down there? I hope you liked this really cool story about a dog, a man, and a Bigfoot. I know that the story might have been a little hard to follow because it was told in such a jumbled way. So I had to change the way it was written a little, but hopefully you can still get the point. If you like what I post, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I'll see you in the next video. When I was young, I was interested in everything that couldn't be explained, like Bigfoot, UFOs, the Bermuda Triangle, and so on. So, I've always kept an open mind about things that don't make sense. Being raised in a Christian home is a strange link to that interest. My dad is a pastor, and he has very strong beliefs about what the Bible says. My brothers and I were taught from a very young age that there are things we can't see or understand and that most people will try to ignore things like miracles, healing, or anything else that seems out of the ordinary. Science couldn't figure out why people also believed in ghosts, demons, and other things from the Old Testament. I bring this up because most people don't think of cryptic Christian beliefs at the same time. But even as a child, it made me open to the idea that things that most people don't believe in might exist, and that it might be in the best interest of modern science to ignore such ideas because they can't be explained by anything we know now. This could be because people think that modern science has all the answers and can't be questioned. I was also taught to be skeptical of authority as a thing and of consensus as a measure of the truth, and I was told to find the truth for myself. We were taught to keep an eye out for times when it might be easier to tell a lie than to tell the truth. This made me aware that truth exists outside of the textbook and that thoughts can be stifled. It also helped me keep my mind open to all kinds of things, both spiritual and not. But we didn't believe in Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, or other silly things. There were clear limits to what we could believe. Some people might think that believing in God is the same as believing in Santa Claus. But this seemed to make me more open to what I didn't know, without making me believe things just because they were new, and more interested in what evidence there was. As far as I know, people don't write books and hold conferences about whether or not Santa exists. When this happened to me, I was already open to the idea of UFOs and thought Bigfoot existed. However, I never believed I would ever see one. I'm not even sure I wanted to at the time or now. When I was a teenager, I was busy with sports, music, and girls, so I put my interest in the unknown in the back of my mind. That is, until one weekend in 1995 or 1996. As best as I can remember, this is what happened. At the time, I lived in a very rural part of southwest Colorado, in a town so small that I could walk out my back door with a fishing pole and a rifle and go hiking without anyone saying a word. I won't say the name of the town because it's small enough that someone could probably figure out who I am just by knowing where I lived. There are a lot of deer and elk in the area, and mountain lions would sometimes come into town and steal livestock and small pets. We could see bears just outside of town, and there are large areas of unoccupied land nearby. I said this to show that, even though I live and have lived in big cities for most of my life, I have also spent a lot of time hunting, fishing, and camping in the country and in the wild. My uncle lives in Denver, and he and his then-wife bought a cabin outside of Fairplay, which is where the old town of South Park City is. The area is called South Park because a park is a flat area or valley at a high elevation in a mountain range. From Denver, you have to drive through places like Breckenridge, which is a ski resort town, to get a sense of the terrain. Around mountain peaks and other places where people rarely or never go, there are large patches of national forest that connect. The cabins in the area were actually just modern houses built in the middle of the woods. They had a bit of a rustic look, but they also had some modern features. He could see other houses from his cabin, and the town wasn't too far away. The area wasn't very populated, but he wasn't alone by any means. There were a lot of open fields, but the houses were built right next to thick forests that went up to the nearby mountains. All you had to do to get into the forest was cross a 2-track dirt road, and you could walk for miles without seeing a single person. This cabin had a large wood patio that went around the back and down one side. The living room had large glass windows that faced the forest. The bathroom downstairs, which we mostly used, had a wall made of semi-opaque glass blocks that faced the forest. There were modern things like lights that turned on when someone moved near the house. The house had 2 stories, and one of the rooms on the second floor had windows that looked out onto a thicket of pine and aspen trees that was about 10 to 15 feet high because the ground went down away from the house on that side. I was 16 or 17 and still in high school at the time. Over the 4th of July holiday, my uncle invited some family and friends to spend a few days at the cabin. We arrived right at dusk. A few days before the 4th, it was my mom and dad, my younger brother, 2 cousins and 2 aunts and uncles all sharing the house for the holiday. As soon as I got out of the car, I felt a huge, blanket-like sense of unease. I really did feel afraid or in danger. I felt like I had just walked into a bad neighborhood as I tried to figure out what was wrong with me and why I was in the woods. I noticed that my little brother seemed nervous, too, so I asked him if he could feel it. When I asked him what he thought it was, he said, "Bigfoot." It seemed like the word came out of his mouth before the thought did. When he said what I was thinking, I shivered and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We got the bags into the house as quickly as we could, and the whole time I was looking over my shoulder at the tree line while trying to act normal. The adults were too busy talking to notice that something was wrong. But I thought that I had to get to the porch light as soon as possible or something bad would happen that night. Everything went as planned, even though the parents talked late into the night, and the kids were all in sleeping bags on the floor of the living room. I think I fell asleep while the adults were still awake. Being inside with them made me feel safe, but I was still very scared of what might be outside the house the next morning when we got up, ate, and went to the bathroom in the usual order for a family gathering. Some of the adults went hiking. The weather was nice, the sky was clear, and there was no longer any feeling of unease. The area was just beautiful. My brother and I talked about what we had said the night before, and I think we both felt silly for being so scared since there was nothing else we could do. We decided to look around the area with the vague goal of finding proof of Bigfoot. My cousin was mostly from the city, but when we told him what we were doing, he was in. In the back of my mind, I had remembered some signs to look for from a book or one of the few TV specials that were made at the time. Before this, no one had ever heard of tree knocks or howling. So we just kept looking for signs of big animals. We found some strange things that morning. I saw some trees that had lost their leaves and bark about 6 to 8 feet up. We found some small buildings and sticks stuck in the ground in strange places. We also found some young trees that had been bent in strange ways. The most important thing we found was an old aspen that had been completely uprooted, and was lying on its side in the middle of a group of other trees that were fine. There were no signs of digging or other tools, and the tree itself didn't look like it was rotting. Even though I was young, I could tell that this couldn't have been caused by wind or some other mechanical force because none of the other trees were hurt. The trees were too close together for a backhoe or truck to get through without damaging other trees. It had been a dry summer, so there were no footprints or other clear signs. But there was nothing I could show an adult without making them think I was crazy. So, we didn't tell anyone about what we had found. Most of the things we found were close to the house. I don't know how old the neighborhood is, but I knew the houses hadn't been there for very long and that the area was slowly being built up, but it was still close to large areas of uninhabited forest. Late in the morning, I went outside and slept in a hammock. The breeze was just right, and wildflowers were in full bloom. It was peaceful and quiet, but one of the nearby cabins was making noise. I could sometimes hear dogs barking. We used to eat hot dogs through a football, and have a great summer day. I forgot what I had felt the night before after a while. That lasted until early afternoon, when the sun started to get close to the mountains on the horizon, almost like a moving fog. I felt the same level of unease and dread as the night before. I argued with myself a bit, trying to get rid of the feeling and telling myself I was being silly and weak, but I couldn't get rid of it, and I didn't feel better until I got back to my house. I was scared of whatever was out there, and it seemed like it not only knew about us but was also interested in us. Since my cousin and I both play guitar and bass and had brought our instruments, we spent the rest of the afternoon playing music upstairs. We even made up a silly, childish song, which I can still remember and play. The guitar riff isn't bad, but I've outgrown the lyrics that compare the past to dirty underwear. Looking back, it's still strange how things felt inside the house, where adults, light, and laughter would make me forget what I was feeling. Then I'd be alone for a minute or go outside to get something from the car, and I'd be reminded again right away. I know I did a good job of hiding it because when I told the people who were there what we saw years later, none of them knew. We were afraid at all. That night, we drove into town, rented the movie Vertigo, if I remember correctly, and ate dinner as a group. Some of the food was being cooked on the grill outside, but I don't know how to tell my dad or uncles that I was scared for them even though they didn't seem to notice. After dinner, there was wine, beer, and dessert, and we put on a little show for the adults, which included the debut of our underwear song. Things were fine until the adults went to their rooms one by one, leaving me, my brother, and my cousin in the living room, which had big windows and thin curtains. Even though my brother and cousin didn't have trouble sleeping, I did. My brother could fall asleep anywhere and sleep through anything. Sometime in the middle of the night when everything was quiet. With a very quiet click, the motion sensor lights turned on. There was no sound, no wind, and even the dog next door, which had been barking all day, was completely quiet. After a few intense minutes, I turned it off and on again and again. I didn't dare look out the windows, but I could picture a big hairy creature walking on two legs around the porch and trying to look in, with only a thin piece of glass and a white piece of fabric between us. I didn't sleep much at all that night. I was about 6 feet tall and 165 pounds, so I was almost an adult. I was as scared as a baby, even though I was in a safe house with 6 adults. I wish one of them was in the room with me. The fear was almost too much to handle. I wouldn't even use the bathroom because I was afraid I would see something through the decorative glass blocks that I couldn't unsee. The next morning, on the 4th, everything was back to normal. I knew that wouldn't last, though. We went outside and looked around some more, but I didn't want to get too far away from the house. We now saw a few more things, but none of them were very important. The day was very cloudy and cold, and there was a chance of a big storm at any moment. The summer weather in the mountains was typical in that it changed all the time. Some people came to a party, but it rained a lot and stopped any fireworks from going off. But strange things were going on in and around the house. Some of the guests brought their dogs. My uncle and his wife also brought their 2 dogs, which have lived together for a long time and get along well. Had a really bad fight out of the blue. My uncle had to hit his dog over the head with a shovel to get her to let go of the other dog. People were crying and yelling, which is something I had never seen before because we didn't have dogs when I was a kid. I heard someone say that the 2 dogs were fighting over who was in charge because there was a 3rd dog around, but I could feel there was something else going on. They could tell that it made them act weird. They had never fought each other before. Around the time that the dogs fought, the feeling came back so strongly that I felt like I was going to crawl out of my skin. So I asked my brother and cousin if they wanted to go hang out inside the cabin since a storm was coming and the dogs were fighting. Everything felt wrong and tense, like something dark was pressing down on me. This time, it felt worse than before. It had just been a vague feeling. I had the feeling that something was nearby. We borrowed some binoculars and went up to the room on the second floor to look out the window at the forest. Up high and out of reach, I felt a little safer. I tried to figure out which way the feeling was coming from, and then I pointed the binoculars at a spot in the trees in that direction. I was zoomed in and moving the binoculars around to try to see anything strange. I started to focus on one aspen, but then I saw a dark shape behind them all. Once my eyes and brain figured out that what I was looking at was matted fur with sticks and leaves stuck to it and the shape of a shoulder, it moved. I almost dropped the binoculars, and my heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I just saw a Bigfoot, and I started shaking. I've never been so scared in my life. I couldn't make sense of what I had seen, and my head was spinning. After I looked through the binoculars, both my brother and my cousin took a turn because I wouldn't even put them back up to my eyes. At first, both of them acted like I was pulling a joke on them, but soon they were both as white as I was. My cousin said he looked right into the face of a person whose skin felt like a gorilla's. He said it was almost like they looked into the binoculars, but the eyes were empty and showed no emotion, which made him even more scared. My brother said he saw the creature's side profile as it turned to look at the clearing. He also said that he looked like a gorilla, but he was sure of what it was and that he was interested in us. We actually shut the blinds and didn't go downstairs for a while until we could act normally again. I still can't believe that I saw something that I thought could have been proof that Bigfoot existed. It was 100 yards away from the house. But I didn't do anything to find real proof. I could have told my uncle or dad, or asked my uncle, who is a photographer, to lend me a camera, but I was too scared. I couldn't even think about looking at it again, let alone going into the woods to find it. In the moment, processing the information makes it feel like your mind is splitting because your eyes are seeing something and sending that information back to your brain. But the brain is telling the eyes to look again because that doesn't fit with what the brain knows should or shouldn't exist. I think some of the fear came from not knowing what was going to happen. I have no idea if the creature would have taken one of us or even if it would have done anything other than watch us. But I had a feeling it knew we knew it was there. We also knew it had the power to kill us if it wanted to. The next morning, we all left the cabin, and I remember being very happy to leave the area. It was years before I told any adults about what we saw on the trip. On another trip across Colorado, I told my dad about it late at night. He didn't say if he believed me or not, but he did say that there was so much wilderness in the US that he thought it was possible for a North American ape to exist and still stay hidden from people. When I told my uncle about it years later, he said he wished I'd told him sooner so he could have started looking because he often went hiking and fishing in that area. He said he felt like he missed out because he didn't know there might have been something in the area. Years ago, they sold the cabin. But many people have seen them in the area in the last few years. They were prints casted about a mile or two from the cabin on the backside of Pikes Peak, near a creek called 4 Mile Creek. So people often see something in the area, and we're not the only ones who have. Since the internet has made it easier for more people to share their stories, more people can do so. I feel much more sure about telling my story now, because the creature's actions seem to fit with the idea that it is only interested in the kids and doesn't care about the adults. I don't know why none of the adults could feel it, but when I think about it, the hairs on the back of my neck still stand up. I've never been that scared before. I didn't always feel directly threatened. I was just afraid of a big thing that knew I was there and could have taken me if it wanted to. I also thought that the reason I didn't feel nervous in the morning but did in the afternoon was because of how that Bigfoot slept and because it might have been curious about us in the afternoon and even into the evening. I've been back to the woods many times since then. But what I saw still bothers me, and I have to work hard not to think about it when I'm out, or the fear can still make me unable to move, even though it's been years. Still, the fact that so many people don't believe it makes more people afraid. From a certain point of view, ignorance can be bliss. On the other hand, I like living in a world where there are still mysteries and science is not as settled as they make it seem.